Elon Musk was known for his towering ambition, his relentless drive to revolutionize industries, and his unshakable confidence in the face of adversity. From founding Tesla to pioneering the vision for a human colony on Mars, he had become one of the most influential figures of the 21st century. But on a crisp Thursday morning, at a tech conference in Silicon Valley, Elon was about to meet someone who would make even him question everything he thought he knew about intelligence. It all started as an innocent exchange of pleasantries. Elon had just finished delivering a keynote address about the future of space travel, discussing the possibilities of reusable rockets and the potential for humans to inhabit the Red Planet. The crowd had been hanging on every word, eager to hear his latest insights. But as he stepped off the stage, a small, unassuming figure caught his eye. A boy, no older than 4, sitting on his mother's lap in the front row. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Elon couldn't help but notice the child's eyes. They weren't like the eyes of any typical 4-year-old. They were sharp, alert, and seemed to carry an intensity that felt out of place. His mother, a well-dressed woman in her late 30s with a soft but confident demeanor, noticed Elon's gaze and smiled politely. "Mr. Musk," she said, standing up, "this is my son, Max. He's quite special." Elon raised an eyebrow, a little taken aback. He'd heard this line before. Parents always thought their children were special, but there was something about the way she said it, a certain conviction in her voice, that piqued his curiosity. Max looked up at Elon, his face expressionless but his eyes full of something much deeper, something knowing. "Hello, Max," Elon said, crouching down to his level, trying to mask his skepticism with a friendly smile. "How old are you?" Max didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied Elon for a moment, his gaze never wavering. It was as though the child was sizing him up, like he could see right through him. Finally, Max spoke in a calm, measured tone. "I'm 4 years old," he said, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. Elon nodded, trying not to let the awkwardness show. 4, huh? That's impressive. You must be learning a lot of things. What's your favorite subject?" Max didn't hesitate. "Space. Rockets. The speed of light. I like knowing what makes things go fast." Elon's eyebrows shot up. This wasn't the usual child's fascination with cartoons or dinosaurs. This was something else. "Space, huh? You want to be an astronaut when you grow up?" Elon asked, his voice betraying a hint of amusement. Max's expression didn't change. "No, I want to go to Mars. I want to figure out how to make it work. Humans need to be on Mars before we destroy everything here." Elon was momentarily stunned. Was this some sort of prank? He glanced at Max's mother, who was watching him closely, a knowing smile on her lips. "You know," Elon began cautiously, "we've been working on that at SpaceX. It's not easy, but we're getting closer to making it happen." Max tilted his head slightly, considering this information. "You're not thinking about it the right way," he said slowly. "You're thinking about how to get to Mars. I'm thinking about how we can stay there." Elon's mind raced. Stay there? What did a 4-year-old know about staying on Mars? The boy's calm demeanor was starting to unnerve him. Maybe he was just a child prodigy, or maybe there was something deeper here. Max continued, as if reading Elon's thoughts. "It's not just about the technology, Mr. Musk. It's about people. You need to make sure they can work together on Mars. Otherwise, it'll be just another failure. People don't work well when they're scared or angry. You need to teach them how to care about each other, how to communicate better." The simplicity of Max's words hit Elon like a punch to the gut. For a moment, he was speechless. How could this child, this 4-year-old, understand something so complex, something he himself had only recently begun to grapple with? Max's mother, sensing the silence, stepped in. "He reads a lot. Books on science, philosophy, psychology. He can discuss quantum physics as easily as he talks about dinosaurs." Elon swallowed hard, feeling an odd mix of awe and disbelief. He had met some of the brightest minds in the world, but no one had ever spoken to him like this. No one had ever seemed so assured of their place in the universe. "Maybe I could learn a thing or two from you," Elon said, forcing a smile. Max didn't smile back. He simply nodded, as though he already knew that his ideas would have an impact. As Elon walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had just shifted. He had been introduced to plenty of young prodigies in his life. There were always stories about children who were too smart for their own good, but Max was different. There was a depth to him, a quiet wisdom that made him feel, for the first time in years, uncomfortable. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. Elon mused, his mind still racing. This wasn't just another quirky encounter. Something told him that this child was no ordinary genius. This meeting, this conversation, would leave everyone involved speechless, and it was only the beginning. The next few weeks passed in a blur of meetings, interviews, and new projects for Elon. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't forget that conversation with Max. He found himself thinking about the child's words often, reflecting on what they might mean not just for Mars, but for humanity's future. As he lay awake in his bed one night, staring up at the ceiling, Elon couldn't shake the question that had been haunting him. What if Max was right? What if the future of humanity wasn't just about technology, but about how we learn to work together as a species? For the first time in a long time, Elon Musk felt unsure about what was to come. And yet, there was something about that feeling, something about Max, that made him want to explore it further. What was it about the conversation with this 4-year-old that left him questioning his entire worldview? Only time would tell. Max Palmer was unlike any other child. While most children his age were busy learning how to count or recognizing shapes and colors, Max was reading books that most high school students wouldn't even attempt. At the age of 3, he had already completed introductory textbooks on physics, chemistry, and even computer science. His mother, Dr. Claire Palmer, a neuroscientist and professor at Stanford, had always known that her son was exceptional, but even she was sometimes in awe of his abilities. Growing up, Claire had been a child prodigy herself, an early graduate of MIT with a PhD in neurobiology by the time she was 24. But nothing prepared her for Max. It wasn't just his intelligence. It was the way his mind worked. He didn't learn information like a typical child. He absorbed it. Concepts that most adults struggled with seemed to enter Max's brain as if they were second nature. Claire had always been careful with Max, trying to balance nurturing his genius with allowing him a childhood. She didn't want him to be isolated, didn't want him to grow up feeling like a freak. But that was difficult when Max could talk about string theory before he could tie his shoes. She was well aware of the implications of his abilities. Some people would see him as a blessing, others a potential problem. And as much as she wished to keep him hidden from the world, Claire knew that the more Max learned, the more the world would take notice. It was a quiet Tuesday evening when Claire first realized just how much Max had grown, not just intellectually, but emotionally. They were sitting in their spacious kitchen, eating dinner together, when Max suddenly looked up from his plate. "Mom," Max said in his calm, deliberate voice, "do you think people will ever stop fighting?" Claire paused, her fork halfway to her mouth. She had been expecting a question about a science topic, black holes, the nature of gravity, the differences between machine learning algorithms. But this was different. "Stop fighting," she echoed, setting her fork down and giving him her full attention. "What do you mean?" Max tilted his head slightly, his deep blue eyes locked on hers. "People always argue. They fight over things they don't understand. Why don't they just talk to each other instead of yelling?" Claire blinked, momentarily caught off guard. She had raised him to be observant, to think critically, but she hadn't expected him to already be thinking about the social dynamics of the world. She thought for a moment before answering. "I think people fight because they're scared. Scared of what they don't know, scared of change," she explained softly. "But talking, really listening, that's something people don't always know how to do." Max nodded thoughtfully. "That's what we need to fix first. Not just the rockets or the computers, but the way people talk to each other. They don't understand that feelings matter as much as facts." Claire's heart ached with a strange mix of pride and worry. She had always known Max was bright, but this was something else. He wasn't just a child who could calculate equations that most adults couldn't. He was a child who understood the human condition in ways that some adults never would. And with that understanding came a great responsibility. 2 weeks after Elon Musk's unexpected meeting with Max, Claire had arranged for Elon to visit their home. She knew Elon was intrigued, but she also knew that it was only a matter of time before his curiosity would drive him to take a more direct interest in Max's abilities. Claire was a pragmatist. She understood that someone like Elon could make a tremendous impact on Max's future, but she also feared the potential fallout. The media, the expectations, the pressure. It could all overwhelm her son. As Elon entered their home, he was immediately struck by the quiet atmosphere. There was no grand display of wealth or status here, just a peaceful, modest house nestled in the hills above Palo Alto. It felt normal, for lack of a better word. The kind of place where a family could live without constant media scrutiny. Max, of course, had no intention of making Elon feel comfortable. He was sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, surrounded by books on subjects ranging from astronomy to neuroscience. His eyes were fixed on a stack of papers, his small fingers tracing over a diagram of the human brain as if he were reading a novel. Elon smiled, despite himself. It was hard not to be impressed by the sheer audacity of this child. No 4-year-old should have the confidence to sit in front of a scientist's detailed neuroanatomical drawings and make sense of it. "Hello, Max," Elon said, crouching down to his level. "I've been thinking about our conversation the other day. You really left me thinking." Max looked up from his papers and gave Elon a small, almost imperceptible nod. "You were thinking about the rockets," he said, his voice soft but steady. "You're trying to get to Mars, but that's only part of the problem." Elon raised an eyebrow, slightly taken aback. "I thought you were interested in space? What's wrong with the rockets?" Max tilted his head and smiled just a little. "The rockets are fine, but if you want to stay on Mars, you have to think about the people. You can't just send machines and technology. You need to teach them how to live there, together. They can't just be astronauts. They need to be people." Elon stared at Max, feeling a strange tug at the edges of his mind. This wasn't just a child spouting off random ideas. This was a child who understood the underlying truths of human interaction, the emotional and psychological factors that govern behavior, on a level most adults never reached. Max continued, as though he were reading Elon's thoughts. "You've been thinking about how to get humans to Mars. But you need to think about what happens when they get there. Will they be able to work together? Will they fight over food? Will they break down under the pressure? That's the hard part. The technology is easy. The humans are the challenge." Elon felt a weight settle on his chest. Max was right, of course. But how could he have missed it? He had always been so focused on the external, the tangible, the rockets, the spaceships, the tech. But Max was talking about something deeper, something that went beyond the physical and straight to the heart of what it meant to be human. For the first time in years, Elon felt unsure of himself. Was he prepared to lead humanity into space? Or was he so focused on the machinery of it all that he had overlooked the very thing that made humans human? Max's words echoed in his mind long after he left Claire and Max's home. The more he thought about their conversation, the more he realized that Max had opened his eyes to something he had been blind to, the emotional infrastructure needed for space exploration. This wasn't just about rockets. This wasn't just about reaching Mars. This was about preparing humans, mentally, emotionally, and psychologically, for the journey. Elon couldn't stop thinking about Max. This child had the kind of wisdom that even the most brilliant minds struggle to comprehend. Maybe, just maybe, this boy would change the way they thought about space travel and humanity itself. Elon couldn't stop thinking about Max. The 4-year-old genius had planted a seed in his mind, and over the next few weeks, the thoughts kept growing, expanding, pulling him into new directions. Every time he thought he had a breakthrough in his Mars colonization plans, Max's words would echo in his mind. "You need to teach people how to live together first." It wasn't the first time Elon had considered the psychological and emotional challenges of space travel. He had always known that sending humans to Mars would require more than just rockets and technology. It would require a new kind of human spirit. But Max had highlighted something deeper, something more profound. What good was all the technology in the world if the people on Mars couldn't work together, couldn't cooperate, or worse, couldn't survive the emotional toll of isolation? Elon had always prided himself on being a visionary, on seeing things that others couldn't, but this felt different. The weight of it felt heavier, somehow. Was he truly ready to be the person who led humanity into the unknown? Could he not just get them to Mars, but help them stay there? It was on one of those restless nights, with the hum of his Tesla charging in the background and the faint glow of the SpaceX mission control center lights filtering through his office window, that Elon found himself making a decision. He would meet with Max again, only this time. He would do more than just ask questions. He would listen. He called Claire that evening. "I'm coming by tomorrow," he said, his voice tinged with urgency. "I need to talk to Max again." The next day, as Elon arrived at Claire's house, he could sense a change in the air. The calm atmosphere he had noticed before had shifted. Max was sitting in his usual spot, surrounded by books, but today he wasn't reading. Instead, he was drawing, sketching something elaborate on a large piece of paper spread out in front of him. As Elon walked in, Max looked up briefly, then returned to his drawing without saying a word. There was a quiet intensity in the air, a sense that the meeting was no longer just a casual conversation, but the beginning of something much larger. Claire greeted Elon with a smile, but noticed the determined look in his eyes. She had been keeping an eye on Max's development over the past few weeks, and she could tell something had changed in Elon. Maybe it was the question of whether humanity was truly ready for the journey to Mars. Maybe it was the realization that he needed someone else to help guide him. Max finally spoke, his voice breaking the silence like a soft echo in a large, empty room. "You came back because you're thinking about the people, aren't you?" Elon froze. There was no surprise in Max's tone, no indication that the boy was anything other than certain. "I came back because you're right," Elon replied slowly. "I've been so focused on getting to Mars, on the tech, the rockets, the machines. But you're right. It's not just about getting there. It's about how we live there." Max looked up, his piercing gaze locking with Elon's. "It's always been about that. You're not just building a new world. You're building new people. People who can work together, who can survive together. It's not just about the technology. It's about understanding the humans who will use it." Elon nodded, his mind racing. "But how do we make them ready? How do we prepare people for something like this?" Max stood up from the floor, carefully rolling up his drawing and handing it to Elon. "This is how," he said simply. Elon unfurled the drawing. It was a diagram, but not one of Mars or rockets. It was a map, but not of land or stars. It was a map of human emotions. At the center, there was a large circle labeled connection, surrounded by smaller circles labeled with words like trust, empathy, communication, collaboration, and resilience. "What is this?" Elon asked, his voice quiet with awe. "It's the emotional infrastructure," Max replied matter-of-factly. "This is what will allow people to survive on Mars. You can't just throw people in a new environment and expect them to work. They need to be trained not just to use technology, but to work together, to support each other, to trust each other. People on Mars will be isolated. They'll need to rely on one another more than they ever have before. Without this, without understanding and practicing these things, nothing will work." Elon's mind was spinning. He had built rockets, designed electric cars, and even sent a car into space. But this was different. This was something entirely new. Max was talking about the unseen, the intangible. He was talking about something Elon had never considered before. The human side of space exploration. "You're telling me," Elon began slowly, "that we need to teach people how to feel before we send them to Mars?" Max didn't hesitate. "Yes, and we need to start now. You can't send people to Mars and expect them to be ready for the mental and emotional challenges of isolation, fear, and uncertainty. The technology might get them there, but it's the human side that will keep them alive." Elon was struck by how simple Max's explanation was. He had expected some complex psychological theory, some breakthrough that could only be explained through hours of research and data. Instead, Max had distilled it down to something fundamentally human. It wasn't about technology, it was about people. The ability to trust one another, to communicate, to collaborate when every instinct told you to be afraid or defensive. For the first time in his life, Elon realized that his greatest challenge wasn't going to be engineering rockets or landing on Mars. It was going to be something far more difficult, preparing the human heart. Max's words lingered with him for days. Elon began to think about the astronauts who had trained for space missions. They spent years learning how to work with complex machines, how to survive in hostile environments. But what about the emotional aspects? What about the toll isolation would take on them? What about the pressure of knowing they might never return home? Elon knew that he had to start thinking about these things, and he knew he couldn't do it alone. Max was onto something. This child, with his simple yet profound understanding of the emotional core of human survival, had the potential to reshape everything. Elon sat down with his team at SpaceX the following week. The conversation that followed was unlike any other. They didn't talk about rockets or technology. They talked about psychology, about teamwork, about what it really meant to send people to Mars. Elon had come to a realization. Mars wasn't just about a new frontier for humanity. It was about humanity itself. And that was going to take more than just the brightest minds. It was going to take hearts and minds that were ready to face the unknown, together. In the weeks that followed the meeting with Max, Elon Musk found himself facing a new kind of challenge, one that wasn't written in any engineering manual, one that couldn't be solved with a new innovation or a shiny new rocket. This challenge was about people, not technology. It was about preparing the human mind, the human heart, for a future that might very well require them to live on Mars for the rest of their lives. Max had changed everything. The way Elon viewed space exploration, the way he viewed his mission, it had all shifted. It was no longer just about getting there. It was about the humans who would get there. They needed more than just the physical tools to survive. They needed emotional resilience, communication skills, empathy, and trust. Elon began to approach the problem from an entirely new angle. As always, he called a meeting with his key team members, engineers, psychologists, sociologists, even philosophers, anyone who could help him navigate the human side of space travel. We've spent years perfecting the rockets, the spacesuits, the food supply, Elon began, standing at the head of the conference table. But we've overlooked something crucial, the people who will live on Mars. We need to prepare them emotionally, psychologically, not just for the journey there, but for what comes after. There was a murmur of surprise around the table. This wasn't something they had ever considered, at least, not seriously. The focus had always been on technology, on overcoming the challenges of space travel. No one had thought about the mental toll it would take on the astronauts who would make the first human landing on Mars. Max had been right. Elon realized that the biggest risk to the success of the mission wasn't a failed rocket launch or malfunctioning equipment. It was human behavior, human interactions. They were going to have to learn how to work together in the most extreme environment imaginable, with no way to escape, no way to reset. Elon's team quickly rallied around the idea, and they began brainstorming a new initiative, an intensive training program for potential Mars colonists. But this wasn't going to be your typical astronaut training. They needed to do more than teach people how to operate complex machinery or conduct scientific experiments. They needed to teach them how to communicate effectively, how to manage conflict, how to handle isolation and fear, how to cope with stress, and how to build the emotional resilience necessary for long-term survival on a foreign planet. The program was dubbed the Mars Human Development Initiative, a comprehensive emotional and psychological training protocol designed to prepare astronauts not just for the technical challenges of space exploration, but for the deeply personal, human challenges they would face once they arrived on Mars. Elon reached out to leading experts in psychology, conflict resolution, and group dynamics. He knew that bringing together a team of people who were experts in both human behavior and space science would be crucial to making this work. The first step was to design a curriculum that addressed the full spectrum of human emotions, from loneliness and fear to hope and connection. The program would include psychological resilience training. Astronauts would be taught techniques for managing stress, anxiety, and the intense psychological pressure that came with living in isolation. Communication and conflict resolution. Given the limited space and the constant proximity of team members, astronauts would be trained in how to communicate effectively and resolve conflicts peacefully and productively. Group dynamics and leadership. Space missions would require collaboration at the highest level. This module would focus on leadership training, team-building exercises, and understanding group dynamics in extreme conditions. Emotional intelligence. Recognizing and understanding one's own emotions and the emotions of others would be essential. Astronauts would learn to identify emotional triggers and develop the skills necessary to maintain emotional balance in stressful situations. Ethical decision-making. As humanity expanded into space, they would face moral dilemmas never before encountered on Earth. The training would include discussions about the ethical considerations of living on Mars and creating a new society. The training began in earnest, but there were challenges from the start. Many of the astronauts had been selected based on their technical skills, their ability to perform under pressure, and their scientific expertise. But when it came to emotional and psychological preparedness, some found it difficult to grasp the importance of the new curriculum. One of the first astronauts to speak up during the initial training session was Dr. Aidan Roberts, a geologist who had spent years studying the geology of Mars and was one of the most qualified members of the mission. "I don't get it," he said, clearly frustrated. "We're training to go to Mars, to conduct scientific research. Why are we wasting time on things like feelings? What we need is to understand the rocks, the atmosphere, the terrain." Elon, who had been quietly observing the discussion, leaned forward. "Aidan," he said in his usual calm but firm tone, "do you think the rocks will be the hardest part of the mission?" The question hung in the air, and for a moment, Aidan was speechless. He had spent so much of his life preparing for the technical challenges of space exploration that he had never really considered the human side of things. But now, looking at Elon, he realized just how much the emotional aspect mattered. "You're right," Aidan admitted. "I hadn't thought about it like that." Elon nodded. "None of us had. But that's why we need to start thinking about it now. The success of the Mars mission isn't just about the technology. It's about the people who are going to live and work on Mars. It's about how we handle the isolation, the fear, the pressure. It's about how we stay human, even when we're millions of miles from home." As the weeks passed, the training program became more than just a series of lectures and exercises. It became a transformative experience for the astronauts. They learned how to navigate the emotional complexities of living in confined spaces, how to resolve conflicts before they became insurmountable, and how to support one another when the weight of their isolation began to take its toll. At the heart of it all was the realization that this wasn't just a mission to explore a new planet. It was a mission to become something new, to create a new model for human society, one where emotional intelligence and collaboration were just as important as scientific discovery and technological advancement. For Elon, watching the astronauts grow and bond over these lessons was a turning point. He knew that they were ready to tackle the physical and technical challenges of Mars. But now, he was confident that they were also ready for the more subtle but equally important challenges, the ones that would test their humanity. In a quiet moment one evening, after a long day of training, Elon found himself thinking back to the first conversation he had with Max. The young boy had taught him an invaluable lesson, that the future of humanity wasn't just about what they could build, but about what they could feel, understand, and share. Max had given him a glimpse into a future where technology and humanity weren't at odds with each other, but worked in harmony to create something truly extraordinary. And now, with this new training program in place, Elon was beginning to believe that they might just be ready for it. It had been 6 months since Elon had initiated the Mars Human Development Initiative. The astronauts had undergone rigorous training, both in technical skills and emotional preparedness. They had learned how to build resilience, manage isolation, and collaborate in the most extreme conditions. But now, they were about to face their first true test, one that would push everything they had learned to the limit. The training center, located just outside of SpaceX headquarters in Hawthorne, California, had been designed to simulate the conditions of life on Mars. It was an enormous, dome-like structure with artificial gravity, limited supplies, and a carefully controlled atmosphere to mimic the Martian environment. Inside, a small group of astronauts had been living for the past 2 weeks, cut off from the outside world, with no direct communication with anyone but each other. They were testing not just their ability to survive in a confined space, but their ability to thrive, mentally, emotionally, and socially. This Mars simulation was the first of many such tests that would take place over the coming years, but it was the most important. The astronauts had been told that this was not just a test of their technical abilities, but of their ability to work as a cohesive team, to handle stress, to navigate conflict, and to remain emotionally stable under pressure. They had been living in the simulation for 2 weeks, and now, Elon was about to witness their response to their first real challenge. The first test began with a simulated emergency. A solar storm had just hit, knocking out communications with Earth and damaging the energy grid. The astronauts were told that they had to work together to restore power and re-establish contact with mission control. However, there was a catch. Due to the limited resources available, they only had a small amount of time to complete the task before their food and water supplies ran out. If they didn't succeed, they would have to rely on their emergency rations, which were limited and not sustainable for long-term survival. As soon as the emergency alert blared, the astronauts sprang into action. They immediately began assessing the damage and formulating a plan. Elon, watching from behind the one-way glass, observed the group carefully. He had been briefed on their training, but this was the real test. How would they handle the pressure? How would they interact with each other when things went wrong? How would they manage their stress in such an isolated, high-stakes situation? At first, things seemed to be going smoothly. The team was working quickly, checking systems, running diagnostics, and coordinating their efforts. But then, something unexpected happened. A disagreement. Dr. Aidan Roberts, the geologist, and Captain Sarah Lee, the mission commander, began arguing over how to prioritize the repairs. Aidan wanted to fix the power grid first, arguing that without electricity, the habitat would quickly become uninhabitable. Sarah, on the other hand, believed they needed to get the communications system up and running first, so they could alert Earth of their situation. The disagreement escalated quickly, with both of them raising their voices, their stress levels visibly rising. The other astronauts stood by, unsure of how to intervene. Elon watched the scene unfold with growing concern. This was the moment he had feared. Would they be able to solve the problem, or would their inability to manage conflict derail the entire mission? It was Max's words that came to Elon's mind at that moment. You need to teach people how to live together first. The pressure was mounting. Elon knew that if the team couldn't figure out how to resolve this disagreement, it would not only jeopardize their mission, it would have profound implications for their long-term survival on Mars. He stepped forward and signaled to the team via the intercom. Sarah, Aidan, I need you to take a step back, Elon said calmly but firmly. This is a simulation, and the point isn't just to fix the problem. It's about how you solve it together. There's no right or wrong here. The only thing that matters is how you work together. For a moment, the room was silent. Elon's voice had a quiet authority that cut through the tension. Aidan and Sarah, both visibly frustrated, exchanged glances. Slowly, they stepped back from the console, and the rest of the team did the same. Elon continued, Now, take a breath. Think about the bigger picture. This isn't just about your solution, Aidan, or your solution, Sarah. It's about the team. What's best for everyone? How can you compromise and figure out a plan that works for all of you? The tension in the room didn't immediately dissipate, but it did begin to shift. Slowly, Aidan and Sarah began to talk, not just about the technical issue, but about what was at stake. They agreed that they needed to prioritize both the power grid and the communication system, but they would work in parallel teams. Aidan would lead the power restoration effort, while Sarah worked with the team to restore communications. Within minutes, the team was back in action. They worked efficiently, each person knowing their role and how it contributed to the overall success of the mission. By the time they completed the repairs and restored contact with mission control, the astronauts had learned something valuable. The success of the mission was not just about technical skill. It was about collaboration, communication, and emotional intelligence. Elon stood silently, watching as the team celebrated their success. He felt a sense of pride and relief. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the proof that the Mars Human Development Initiative was working. The astronauts had faced their first real test and had emerged stronger, more unified, and more resilient. After the simulation ended, Elon gathered the team for a debrief. The room was quiet as they sat, each person reflecting on what had just happened. Elon took a deep breath and addressed them. You did more than just fix a power grid or a communication system today, he said. You showed what you're made of. You showed that you can manage conflict, you can collaborate, and you can adapt under pressure. This is exactly what we need to succeed on Mars. Captain Sarah Lee spoke first. It was tough, but I think we all learned a lot today. We had to put our personal differences aside and focus on the bigger picture. Dr. Aidan Roberts nodded in agreement. It wasn't just about the tech. It was about how we worked together. I'm glad we had the emotional training, because it made all the difference. Elon smiled, proud of how far they had come. This is just the beginning. There will be more tests ahead, and they will be harder. But if you can handle this, if you can handle the emotional and psychological pressures of isolation, then you're ready for Mars. As Elon left the debriefing room, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The astronauts were not just learning how to survive on Mars, they were learning how to thrive. And that, he realized, was the most important lesson of all. Max's words echoed in his mind once more. It's about the people, Elon. It's always been about the people. And for the first time in his life, Elon believed that they might actually be ready to build a new world, not just technologically, but emotionally. The success of the first Mars simulation had been a turning point, not just for Elon Musk's vision of space colonization, but for the team of astronauts preparing to lead humanity's most audacious journey. The team had learned that while technology was crucial, the human side of the mission, emotion, communication, conflict resolution, was just as essential. But Elon knew this was only the beginning. The hardest challenges were still ahead. The training didn't end with the completion of the simulation. In fact, it was only the first of many. Elon and his team had built a solid foundation, but to make Mars colonization a reality, the astronauts needed to push their limits. They needed to endure not just isolated simulations but real-life trials that tested their endurance, emotional resilience, and problem-solving skills in extreme environments. A month after the Mars simulation, Elon took the next step, an extended training exercise that would push the astronauts even further. This time, they would simulate the entire journey, from the moment they left Earth's atmosphere to the first few months on Mars. The exercise would last for an entire 90 days, more than twice the length of a typical mission to the Red Planet. This would be their longest test yet, and this time there would be no turning back. The astronauts would be confined in an isolated, self-sustained environment. The habitat, designed to simulate a Mars base, would cut them off from the outside world for the full 90 days. No direct communication with Earth. No escape. At the launch site, Elon watched as the crew boarded the simulation shuttle. He had been a part of countless launches and projects, but this one felt different. This was more than just technology. This was a test of human spirit, of mental fortitude, of the future of civilization. As the crew entered the shuttle, Elon's thoughts turned back to Max. The boy had become an enigma to him, a reminder of what truly mattered. Every decision he made now was through the lens of that conversation. Teach people how to live together first. And now, the astronauts would have to prove that they could do just that. The first few weeks were manageable. The astronauts, despite the limited space and the simulated Martian environment, went through their routines: exercise, research, experiments, and daily duties. The emotional and psychological preparation had been extensive, and most of the crew was handling the isolation fairly well. There was still tension, of course, but the communication training had worked. Conflicts were addressed early, and team morale remained high. But as the days dragged on, something began to shift. The novelty of the simulation started to wear off, and the isolation began to sink in. The team members began to experience the deep mental and emotional toll that Mars colonization would require. It was around day 45 that the first cracks began to show. Sarah Lee, the mission commander, had always been known for her composure, her ability to remain calm under pressure. But now, after weeks of constant isolation, the weight of the responsibility seemed to be taking its toll. She began showing signs of burnout, irritability, difficulty focusing, and frequent bouts of exhaustion. "Sarah, you need to take a break," Aidan said gently, noticing her lack of focus during a routine systems check. "You've been pushing yourself too hard." "I'm fine," she snapped, then quickly softened. I just need to stay sharp. We can't afford to mess up now. Not when we're this close." But Aidan wasn't convinced. He had been trained to notice the signs of stress, both in himself and in others, and Sarah was showing every symptom of burnout. But how do you convince a team leader to step back when the entire mission was on her shoulders? Elon, back on Earth, had been briefed on Sarah's condition. He knew that this kind of stress was inevitable in such an isolated environment, but it still worried him. He had learned the hard way that leaders, especially those who carried the weight of everyone's success or failure, were often the first to burn out. He reached out to Sarah through the secure communication channel. "Elon," she answered, her voice tight with fatigue. "We're fine. The mission is going well. I just need a bit more time to get through this. We can handle it." "Sarah, the point of this mission is to learn how to survive, not just on Mars, but as humans," Elon replied. "You can't carry the weight of the team alone. We need you to be strong, but that doesn't mean you have to do it all by yourself." There was a long pause before Sarah spoke again, her voice softer now. I know you're right. It's just so much. I feel like I'm letting everyone down." "Elon's right," Aiden chimed in from the background. "We're all in this together. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be human." Sarah let out a long sigh, and for the first time in weeks, Elon could hear the weight lifting from her voice. "Thanks. I'll take some time off. I need it." Meanwhile, back in the habitat, the rest of the crew was beginning to feel the pressure as well. The isolation, the constant confinement, and the ongoing stress were starting to wear on everyone. The team dynamics that had been so strong in the beginning were now showing signs of strain. It wasn't just Sarah. The isolation was getting to them all in different ways. Some became withdrawn, while others started to clash more frequently. It was a delicate balance. The astronauts had been trained to manage conflict and stress, but nothing could prepare them for the reality of living in such a high-pressure, confined space for such an extended period. By day 60, the mission was officially in crisis mode. A second major disagreement arose between Dr. Aiden Roberts and Commander Sarah Lee. This time, it was over a scientific experiment that had gone awry. The experiment, meant to test Mars soil composition, had failed, and the resources required to fix the issue were limited. It was a critical failure, one that could jeopardize their entire mission. Aiden, ever the scientist, wanted to push forward, using whatever resources were left to find a solution. Sarah, however, was more cautious. She believed that taking such risks with limited supplies could lead to bigger problems down the line. The tension quickly escalated. Aiden, frustrated and exhausted, raised his voice. "We don't have time to be cautious. We're on the clock. Every minute we waste is a minute we lose in our timeline. This mission is bigger than any one experiment." Sarah, her voice tight with emotion, retorted, "And if we run out of supplies? What do we do then, Aiden? You can't just keep pushing without thinking of the bigger picture." The argument grew heated, and for the first time, Elon wasn't sure how this would end. He had hoped that their training would be enough to prevent moments like this, but now, with both of them on the brink, it seemed like they were about to unravel. Elon had to act, and fast. He called in an emergency video conference with the crew. The tension in the air was palpable, even through the screen. "Everyone, take a deep breath," Elon said, his voice steady but firm. "You've been out there for 2 months. This is tough, but it's nothing you can't handle. You need to focus on the bigger picture. No one is alone in this mission. Not Sarah, not Aiden, not any of you. You're a team, and this team is strong." There was silence on the other end. Then, slowly, Sarah spoke up. "We've got to do this together. I was wrong to think I could do it alone. I should have asked for help sooner." Aiden, too, softened. "We'll figure this out together." Elon smiled, relieved. The astronauts had passed their second real test, this one harder than the first, and they had emerged stronger. The long road ahead was daunting, but this moment, this breakthrough, showed that they were not just prepared for the journey. They were ready for the fight to keep humanity alive. The first 90-day training exercise had proven to be a critical turning point for the crew. They had endured the physical, emotional, and psychological stresses of isolation, conflict, and limited resources. By the time they emerged from the simulation, Elon Musk knew they were closer to something real, something that could truly lay the groundwork for humanity's future on Mars. But there was one critical question that lingered in his mind. Were they ready for the real thing? The Mars Human Development Initiative had been a success in theory, but reality was much harder to gauge. The team had shown resilience and problem-solving skills under pressure. They had learned how to live together, but the true test was still ahead of them. What would happen when they were actually living on Mars, without the comforts of Earth to fall back on? Elon, for all his confidence in the project, still knew that they were embarking on the unknown. After the 90-day simulation, the team was given a 2-month break to decompress. They had earned it, but the pressure to begin the real mission, an actual journey to Mars, was only growing. Elon had gathered his team at SpaceX headquarters to discuss the next steps. "We've made great progress," Elon said, his voice calm but purposeful. "But now it's time to take the next leap. We've trained for this moment. We've learned how to survive in the harshest of conditions. We've learned to work together, to support one another when things get tough. Now, we prepare for the real mission. It's time to build the colony." Elon's words hung in the air. For a brief moment, there was an uneasy silence. The crew, despite their extensive training, knew just how high the stakes were. What awaited them on Mars was nothing short of the unknown. Max's image flashed through Elon's mind as he considered the gravity of the mission. The boy with the mind of a genius, but the heart of a child. He remembered the way Max had questioned the necessity of the mission to Mars, asking why they were choosing to colonize a planet so barren. "Why don't we fix Earth first?" Max had asked. Elon had never truly been able to answer that question, at least not in a way that would satisfy a child. But he'd had to confront it himself many times over the years. The truth was simple. Earth was dying in many ways. Pollution, political instability, and climate change were real and pressing issues. But humanity couldn't afford to stop looking toward the stars. The long-term survival of humanity depended on it. 2 months later, the crew was back in training, this time in the real mission environment, the SpaceX Launch Complex 39A in Florida. The shuttle was ready, and the team's mission plans were locked in. The entire world had been watching. Every news outlet, every social media platform, every space enthusiast, everyone was waiting to see what Elon Musk and his team would do next. But this time, it wasn't just a simulation. There would be no training wheels, no backup. The astronauts were about to embark on a journey that would take them further than humanity had ever gone before. Mars, the red planet, loomed large in their minds. The journey to Mars was calculated to take 6 months. During those 6 months, the crew would have to endure extreme conditions, including zero gravity, radiation, and constant isolation. The shuttle was designed to be self-sufficient, with hydroponic systems to grow food, recycling systems to conserve water, and communication systems to stay in touch with Earth, although the signal would take nearly 20 minutes to travel one way. No more instant gratification. Elon had made sure they were ready for the journey, but no one could predict how the crew would handle the reality of being so far from Earth. There would be no quick trips home if something went wrong. As the crew entered the shuttle, Elon stood at the launch pad, watching the final moments before takeoff. The team suited up, checked systems one last time, and prepared for what would be the longest, most dangerous journey of their lives. "Take good care of each other," Elon said over the comms, his voice steady but filled with an undeniable weight. "You are pioneers. You are making history. And when you get to Mars, you will start something no one has ever done before. It's not just about technology. It's about creating a new future for humanity." Elon paused, then added softly, "And remember, we're all here for you. You won't be alone." The shuttle lifted off with a roar, soaring into the sky as the countdown clock ticked away. The rocket's engines burned bright as it cleared the atmosphere, leaving Earth behind. The astronauts aboard the shuttle looked out the small windows as the planet shrank to a blue speck in the distance. For the crew, it was an emotional moment. The reality of what they were doing had finally hit. This wasn't just a mission. It was a journey that would change the course of human history. They were not just astronauts. They were the first people in human history to travel to another planet. The pressure was immense, but so was the opportunity. Weeks passed, and the crew began to settle into their rhythm. The novelty of space travel faded as the isolation and monotony set in. Days blended into nights, and the Earth became nothing more than a distant memory. The crew worked in shifts, growing their food, conducting scientific experiments, and maintaining the systems that would keep them alive. But the vastness of space, The complete lack of human contact for months at a time began to wear on them. It was one thing to train for isolation. It was another to actually experience it. There were moments when the silence was deafening, when the stillness of the spacecraft felt like an oppressive weight. Even the closest of teams began to feel the strain of being so far from home, from everything they had ever known. Sarah, who had been a pillar of strength during the training exercises, found herself struggling more than she had anticipated. She kept her emotions in check, but sometimes, when she was alone, she would let herself break down. A few tears, a quiet moment of reflection. She missed her family, her friends. She missed the sun on her face. Aiden, always the logical one, was consumed with the science. He poured himself into the experiments, hoping that the data would provide some comfort in the endless void of space. But even his sharp mind couldn't avoid the creeping feeling of isolation. It wasn't until they passed the halfway point of the journey that something unexpected happened. A technical malfunction in the shuttle's life support system caused a brief but terrifying loss of oxygen levels. It wasn't a major crisis, but it was enough to shake the crew to their core. For the first time, they were forced to confront just how fragile their existence was. Their survival depended on a complex network of systems that, if they failed, could mean certain death. Sarah and Aiden worked together, alongside the rest of the crew, to make the necessary repairs. It was a tense few hours, but they succeeded, and the system was restored to full functionality. The close call was a wake-up call for everyone. "We're not just astronauts anymore," Sarah said quietly as they gathered to debrief. "We're survivors. We've got to take care of each other, no matter what happens." Aiden nodded. "We can't afford to let our guard down, not for a second. If we do, it could cost us everything." Elon, listening in from Earth, knew that this was the kind of lesson they had to learn, even if it was painful. Space was unforgiving. Mars would be even more so. And while they had trained for this, nothing could truly prepare them for the challenges of being the first humans to set foot on another planet. But despite the challenges, Elon felt a spark of hope. The team was learning. They were adapting. They were proving to themselves, and to the world, that humanity had what it took to thrive on Mars. The journey ahead was still long and filled with unknowns, but for the first time, Elon truly believed that the dream of a Martian colony might just become a reality. The journey to Mars had been long and grueling, but the end was finally in sight. After 6 months in space, the crew could see Mars in the distance. A red that had once seemed so far away, now growing larger with every passing day. For Sarah, Aiden, and the rest of the team, the enormity of their mission had truly started to sink in. They weren't just space travelers anymore. They were pioneers, the first humans to ever set foot on another planet. Every day, the crew could feel the tension rising as the reality of their arrival on Mars grew ever closer. But there was no time to waste. There were critical systems to check, final preparations to make, and mental exercises to reinforce before the descent. Elon had been in regular communication with the team, offering advice and words of encouragement, but he also reminded them of the risks. Mars was unforgiving, and nothing could guarantee their survival. As much as they had trained for this moment, nothing could truly prepare them for the unknown. The day of the descent arrived. The countdown had begun, and the crew gathered in the command module, each member suited up and ready to go. The shuttle, Discovery, was set to make its entry into the Martian atmosphere and land at the designated site for their first habitat module, Ares Base. Elon's voice echoed through their earpieces. "This is the moment we've been waiting for. Trust the training. Trust each other." Sarah, the mission commander, nodded. Her heartbeat was steady, but inside, a storm raged. She knew that this would be the most dangerous part of the entire mission. The landing wasn't just a symbolic event. It was the start of something much bigger. If they succeeded, they would prove that humanity could survive on Mars. But if they failed, well, failure wasn't an option. As the shuttle approached Mars, the crew went through their final checks. Sarah's hand hovered over the controls. The tension in the cockpit was thick, each breath slow and deliberate. Outside, Mars loomed large, its surface covered in a mixture of rusty red plains and towering mountains. The landscape looked alien, eerie, and yet incredibly inviting. They were about to land on a world no human had ever walked before. The descent began smoothly at first, with the shuttle passing through the Martian atmosphere. The protective heat shields, designed to handle the friction of re-entry, held up as expected. But then, as they neared the surface, something went wrong. A warning light flashed on the control panel, something about the parachutes. Sarah's pulse quickened. "Aiden, what's going on?" she asked, her voice sharp with urgency. Aiden was already on it. He quickly accessed the shuttle's diagnostics. "It's a glitch," he said, not sounding as calm as he would have liked. "We've lost pressure in one of the main descent modules. It's slowing the parachutes down." Sarah cursed under her breath. The shuttle was still descending rapidly, the ground getting closer and closer. They were approaching the designated landing site at an alarming speed. "Can we fix it?" Sarah demanded, trying to stay calm. "I'm adjusting for manual control," Aiden said, fingers flying over the console. "We'll have to do this the old-fashioned way." The rest of the crew held their breath as Aiden expertly piloted the shuttle in a manual descent, navigating through a series of emergency systems. Sarah could hear her heartbeat in her ears, but she forced herself to focus. Aiden's hands didn't waver, his eyes locked on the planet's surface below. The ground was coming up fast, and the thrusters had to fire at the perfect moment to slow their descent. This was a high-risk move. They didn't have much room for error. "Brace for impact," Sarah ordered, her voice steady, though her stomach churned. There was a moment of silence, and then a deafening roar. The shuttle's landing thrusters fired just in time, sending a jolt through the craft as it slammed into the Martian soil. The entire shuttle shook, but they had made it. They were down. Safe. For now. The crew sat still for a few seconds, as the sound of thrusters died down and the shuttle stabilized. They had landed, but not without a fight. "Status report," Sarah called out, her voice slightly trembling now that the immediate danger had passed. "Systems are stable," Aiden responded, looking over his console. "Life support intact. We've made it." Sarah let out a long breath. "Good work, everyone." The crew slowly exhaled in unison, the tension in their bodies easing. They had made it. They had touched down on Mars. The feeling was indescribable, a mixture of relief, pride, and awe. But as Sarah looked out the window, she realized something. Mars was beautiful, desolate, yes, but beautiful. The landscape stretched out before them, an alien world that no human had ever set foot on until now. But it was theirs. It was their new home. As the crew began to unpack and suit up in their Martian gear, Sarah looked at each of them, her eyes meeting Aiden's. "We've just made history, but the real work starts now. We've got to get the habitat up and running." The team nodded, silently agreeing. They had spent months training for this moment, but now they had to build a foundation for humanity's future. The habitat modules were designed to support life on Mars, but they required careful assembly and testing before they could provide a safe, sustainable living environment. It would take weeks to fully establish a working colony. And that was just the beginning. Max's words echoed in Elon's mind as he watched the footage of the landing. "Why don't we fix Earth first?" he had asked. Elon knew that the boy was right in many ways. The problems on Earth were vast and pressing, but humanity had always looked to the stars. The potential for survival on Mars wasn't just about escaping Earth's problems. It was about expanding the human footprint in the universe. The Mars colony would be the foundation of humanity's future. It was a beacon of hope, proof that mankind could adapt, overcome, and thrive in the harshest of environments. It was about pushing the boundaries of what was possible. The crew spent the next few days unloading supplies, setting up communication systems, and assembling the first of the habitat modules. Every task was methodical, precise. This was no longer a simulation. This was the real thing. The stakes were higher than ever. Elon watched from Earth, but his thoughts were elsewhere. There was a quiet moment during a communication session with the crew when he found himself thinking about Max again. He had seen the boy just a few months earlier, asking difficult questions that no one could fully answer. But now, as the crew set foot on Mars, Elon couldn't help but wonder, had they done the right thing? As the days passed, the reality of Mars began to sink in. The red dust that clung to everything. The isolation. The constant struggle for survival. Yet, amid all the challenges, there was a growing sense of pride and wonder. The crew had planted their flag on a new world. They were humanity's first colony on Mars. The red planet awaited them, full of unknowns and untapped potential. But they were here to stay. The true test of their mission had just begun. The initial euphoria of landing on Mars had quickly given way to the harsh realities of survival. The Martian landscape stretched out in every direction, a vast, barren desert of red dust and rocky terrain. There was no lush greenery, no buzzing wildlife, just the silent, unforgiving face of an alien world. The first few days had been a whirlwind of activity, setting up habitats, testing equipment, and making sure life support systems were fully functional. It was all about survival, about ensuring they could live here, long-term. But as the days passed, Sarah and the team knew that they weren't just here to survive. They were here to thrive. "We need to start thinking about the long-term picture," Sarah said one evening as the crew gathered inside the command habitat, their temporary base. The sterile, metallic walls of the module seemed to close in on them after a while, and Sarah found herself yearning for the comforting chaos of Earth. But there was no time to waste on sentimentality. This was Mars. We need to focus on building a sustainable colony. It's not just about survival now. It's about creating a place where future generations can live and thrive. We have the resources, but we need to be smart. Aiden, as always, was already deep into calculations. The hydroponic system is operational, but it still needs some tweaking. We've got to optimize food production. Right now, we're relying on rations, but if we want to make this permanent, we need to start growing our own food. Sarah nodded. And that's just one piece of the puzzle. We need energy, water, shelter, and we need it all to be self-sustaining. Our reliance on Earth will have to be minimal, eventually. The team had arrived with a range of pre-manufactured modules, advanced life support systems, and solar panels. But they were also faced with challenges that hadn't fully been apparent during their training. Mars was cold, very cold, and even with the solar panels, they could only generate so much energy. Windstorms, which had been simulated in training, were a real concern. The dust was everywhere, clogging equipment and creating hazards they hadn't fully accounted for. There was no quick fix for these problems, and it became evident that each solution would require time, resources, and creativity. They weren't just pioneers. They were problem solvers at the edge of human capability. The first task Sarah gave the team was to build a robust and reliable greenhouse to grow food. They set up an area of their habitat module specifically for hydroponic farming, where they could grow plants in nutrient-rich water instead of soil. However, it wasn't as easy as planting seeds and waiting for them to grow. Sarah and Aiden worked together on the design of the greenhouse, carefully considering the amount of light, heat, and water the plants would need. The Martian atmosphere was extremely thin, and while the sun's light was still strong, it was filtered through a dusty haze. Without the right conditions, even the hardiest plants would fail. "I think we can use the solar panels to provide heat during the day, but we'll need an additional heat source at night. The temperature on Mars drops dramatically once the sun sets," Aiden said as he reviewed the calculations. "I agree," Sarah said, thinking out loud. "We might need to create a more efficient storage system for solar energy, like a thermal battery that stores heat during the day and releases it during the night." Meanwhile, Max's voice echoed in Elon's mind again. "Why don't we fix Earth first?" The question had never fully left him. Mars was a beacon of hope, but it wasn't without its costs. Humanity was choosing to take on this massive challenge when there was so much to be done on Earth. He couldn't ignore the glaring irony. They were building a future on Mars, but back on Earth, the fight for survival was just as urgent. Elon continued to watch every communication from the crew, each update on the habitat construction, each new breakthrough. But despite the technological triumphs, the weight of the question loomed over him. The greenhouse began to take shape, with each piece of technology integrated and tested for maximum efficiency. The crew worked tirelessly, testing the limits of the Martian environment. But there were other tasks to tackle as well: waste recycling, air filtration, and the construction of more habitats. They were in the business of turning this barren world into a place where people could live and live well. One evening, as Sarah and Aiden reviewed the data from their experiments, Sarah looked up at the small window of the habitat. The Martian sky was eerily beautiful, with faint dust storms swirling in the distance. For a brief moment, she let herself reflect on how far they had come. They were surviving. They were building. But they were also changing Mars in ways that would never be undone. Do you ever think about what this will mean? Sarah asked Aiden. What it'll mean for humanity. I mean, this isn't just about a few of us being here. This is the first step towards something much bigger. Aiden nodded, his face thoughtful. Every day, we're making history here. But I think it's more than that. We're showing Earth that we can do this, that it's possible to adapt, to survive, to build a future beyond our planet. The next phase of the project was the construction of the Mars Habitat Expansion, a larger module that would house additional crew members. As the base grew, so did the team's understanding of the challenges they faced. They couldn't rely on Earth for much longer. Soon, they'd have to be fully self-sustaining. There were moments of tension. The days were long, and sometimes the isolation would get to them. They were only human, after all. But there were also moments of hope. The crew grew closer, relying on each other in ways they hadn't anticipated. They began to forge relationships that would last a lifetime. Relationships built on trust, collaboration, and the shared goal of making Mars a new home for humanity. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. The crew settled into their new rhythm, building the first permanent colony on Mars. A part of Sarah still couldn't believe it. She had always dreamed of this, but now that she was living it, the enormity of it was almost too much to grasp. As the crew gathered one evening to celebrate the successful completion of the first habitat module, Sarah couldn't help but reflect on the journey so far. There had been moments of doubt, moments of fear, but there had also been triumphs. They had managed to build a self-sustaining base on a foreign planet, and they had done it together. This is just the beginning, Sarah said, raising a glass of filtered water and a toast. We've built something that will outlast us, something that will carry humanity into the future. We're not just surviving anymore. We're living. The crew joined in the toast, and for a moment, everything seemed to fall into place. They were no longer just visitors to Mars. They were a part of it. The colony they were building would stand as a testament to humanity's resilience and determination. But as Sarah gazed out the window, her thoughts returned to Earth. She wondered if anyone back home understood what they were doing out here. She wondered if they even cared. Mars might be the future, but Earth still needed saving. Still, there was no turning back now. They were building a new world, and with every passing day, the dream of a thriving Martian colony seemed more and more possible. What do you think the biggest challenge will be for the Mars colony as it grows? What would you do to help make life on Mars sustainable? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The crew had made remarkable progress on Mars, but there was still so much to be done. With the first habitat module completed and the greenhouse operational, the team was beginning to feel a sense of accomplishment. However, this newfound optimism was tempered by the reality that their work was far from over. They were still in the early stages of building a sustainable colony, one that could survive without Earth's help. The Martian environment was brutal, and the challenges they faced were ever-present. The thin atmosphere, extreme temperatures, dust storms, and radiation exposure were just the beginning. The team knew that their every move would have to be calculated, every system tested and retested. It was no longer just about surviving day to day. It was about thriving, creating a permanent presence on the red planet. As Sarah walked through the base, she couldn't help but feel a sense of awe at how far they had come. A year ago, she had been staring at a screen on Earth, watching simulations of Mars missions. Now, she was standing on the surface of the planet, breathing air filtered through systems they designed and built themselves. But as she moved through the corridors, her gaze often fell to the small window that looked out onto the vast, barren landscape. The Martian surface was as unforgiving as it was beautiful, and Sarah knew that they couldn't afford to grow complacent. "Sarah, can we talk?" Aiden's voice interrupted her thoughts. Sarah turned to see him standing by one of the control panels, a slight frown on his face. His brow was furrowed, and she could tell that something was weighing heavily on his mind. "Of course," she said, walking over to him. Aiden hesitated for a moment, then spoke. "I've been running some simulations. With the current setup, we'll be able to sustain the habitat for another few months, maybe a year. but we're going to hit a critical point. We're almost at our resource limits. The water reserves are running low, and while we've made progress with the hydroponics, we'll need to expand production to meet the crew's needs. Sarah nodded, already aware of the problem. Water on Mars was one of their biggest challenges. There were no lakes or rivers to draw from, and extracting water from the soil was a painstakingly slow process. They had water recycling systems in place, but those systems were only effective for so long. They would need to find a more sustainable way to generate water and fast. I've been thinking about that, she said. We could try to extract water from the atmosphere. The process isn't perfect, but it's something. We could also explore drilling deeper into the soil to find ice deposits. I'll reach out to Elon and see if SpaceX has any additional resources or advice. Aiden looked thoughtful. We'll need a plan B, in case that doesn't work. If we can't find a reliable water source, the whole mission is at risk. Sarah placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. We'll find a way. We always do. As Sarah continued to review the daily reports, it became increasingly clear that the challenges ahead were immense. They had made progress, but the harsh reality of Mars was creeping in, reminding them that no matter how advanced their technology was, nature was always one step ahead. One of the greatest unknowns was how long the habitat modules would last. The materials they had used were built to withstand extreme temperatures and the Martian dust storms, but the wear and tear over time could compromise the integrity of the structures. If the modules began to fail, they would need to be reinforced, or worse, rebuilt. The team had designed the modules with redundancy in mind, but even the best-laid plans couldn't account for everything. The solar panels, for instance, had been delivering a steady flow of energy, but a dust storm could block out sunlight for days, possibly weeks, at a time. Without constant power, life support systems, water recyclers, and heating mechanisms would fail. They couldn't risk being caught unprepared. Sarah knew they needed more energy storage solutions, better batteries, more efficient solar arrays, and a backup power system for emergencies. We can't keep waiting for a breakthrough, Sarah said during their weekly meeting. We have to take action now. We've got to expand our capabilities. We're going to need more energy storage, more food production, and better waste recycling. And we need to start developing a long-term solution for water extraction. If we can't get these things in place soon, we'll face a real crisis. Aiden nodded. Agreed. I'll get to work on improving the energy storage systems, but we also need to look into other power sources. Wind energy, for instance. Mars has frequent dust storms, but when the winds do settle, they could be useful for generating power. I'll work on the water extraction, Sarah said, her mind racing with possibilities. And let's keep the communication channels open with Elon. His team might have ideas for some of these issues, and we need all the help we can get. The days turned into weeks, and the crew continued to work tirelessly on their respective projects. It was grueling work, with long hours and little rest. But each breakthrough, each new discovery, brought them one step closer to building a permanent, self-sustaining colony on Mars. One of the biggest challenges they faced was psychological. The isolation of being on Mars, so far from Earth, weighed heavily on everyone. They had all been trained to handle the mental strain of space travel, but the reality was different. There was no escape. No walk in the park, no friends to meet for coffee, no phone calls home. Max's words echoed in Elon's mind once again. Why don't we fix Earth first? Elon knew that humanity's future lay in space, that expanding beyond Earth was essential for the survival of the human race. But he couldn't shake the feeling that Mars was a luxury, something that was taking resources away from solving the issues on Earth: climate change, overpopulation, political instability. The thought gnawed at him, especially as the crew continued to report back on the difficulties they faced. Back on Mars, the crew held up, despite the weight of their challenges. Their progress was slow, but they were making strides. The water extraction project was moving forward, and the solar panels had been enhanced to provide more energy storage. The hydroponics were expanding, and the first crops of Martian-grown vegetables were being harvested. It wasn't perfect, but it was working, and it had to. One evening, as Sarah sat at the control panel reviewing data from the water extraction system, a message from Elon came through. She quickly opened it, eager for any updates or advice. Sarah, the message began. I know things are tough, But you and your team are doing something that will change the future of humanity. Keep pushing. You're not just building a colony on Mars. You're proving that we can adapt, overcome, and thrive in the most hostile environments. You're pioneers. And what you're doing is just the beginning. Sarah smiled as she read the message. It was a small bit of encouragement, but it was enough to keep her going. The challenges were many, but the crew was resilient. They knew that Mars was a harsh, unforgiving world, but they also knew that they were the ones who had the power to change it. They were the ones who would make Mars a new home for humanity. The real work was just beginning. The crew had been on Mars for over a year now. The days were long, the work relentless, but with each passing moment, they moved closer to turning their dream into a reality, building a self-sustaining colony on the red planet. But despite their successes, the challenges seemed to multiply. There was always something that needed fixing, adjusting, or improving. Survival was one thing, but living? That was a whole different game. Sarah stood by the observation window, watching the Martian landscape stretch out endlessly before her. The endless red dust, the jagged rocks, and the dark sky, a stark reminder of just how far they were from Earth. It was beautiful in a way, but also stark and isolating. Every time she looked out at that empty world, she was reminded of what they were up against. Yet, she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. They were making it work. They were building a future here. But Mars was a tough teacher. Every new solution they came up with brought new obstacles to overcome. Sarah, I think we've got it. Aiden's voice broke through her thoughts. Sarah turned to see him standing by one of the workstations, a mix of excitement and anxiety on his face. "What's got you so excited?" she asked, walking over. "I've been working on the water extraction system," Aiden said, his fingers tapping nervously on the tablet in his hands. "We've been using the atmospheric condensers to pull in moisture, but they're just not producing enough. So, I've adapted one of the old rover drills to extract ice from beneath the surface. It's not a perfect system, but if it works, we could have a significant water supply." "Really?" Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Water had been their greatest challenge, and the thought of a reliable water source, something sustainable, was a game-changer. Aiden nodded, his eyes gleaming. "It's a prototype, but I've run the numbers. We'll need to send the rover out in the next few days to confirm, but if we hit a significant ice pocket, we'll be able to extract water far more efficiently than we've been able to so far." "That's huge." Sarah's voice was filled with awe. If they could unlock a reliable water source, it would be a giant leap forward. It would allow them to scale up food production, improve their living conditions, and ensure the long-term survival of the colony. "Let's get started. Make sure the rover is prepped and ready for the mission. We'll need everyone on standby to monitor the data." The next few days were filled with preparations. Sarah, Aiden, and the rest of the crew worked together to get the rover ready for its maiden mission, a journey that could either solve one of their most pressing problems or leave them grappling with the harsh reality of Mars. As the rover rolled out of the habitat and into the Martian landscape, a sense of anticipation gripped the crew. Sarah stood beside the communication console, watching the rover's movements as they tracked it through the dust. It was an eerie feeling, sending a machine out into the unknown, knowing that it held their hopes for the future. The mission was tense. As the rover drilled into the soil, it took several attempts to find a significant ice deposit. The crew held their collective breath as they watched the data stream in. Then, finally, a breakthrough. A large deposit of ice was detected about 10 meters beneath the surface. "We hit it," Aiden's voice crackled through the comms, his tone a mixture of disbelief and excitement. "We've got ice." The extraction process was a delicate one. Ice needed to be melted into water, purified, and stored. It wasn't going to be a quick fix, but the discovery of ice beneath the surface was a major win. Sarah felt a renewed sense of hope. They were closer than ever to creating a sustainable home on Mars. "Sarah, we've got more data to review," Aiden said, snapping her back to the present. "The systems are working, but we've got to make sure that the water doesn't become contaminated as we extract it. We're not out of the woods yet." She nodded. "I know, but this is the breakthrough we've been waiting for. Let's keep moving forward. And let's start thinking about how we can scale this up. We'll need a system that works for more than just one ice pocket." As the days passed, The ice extraction system continued to improve. With each successful cycle, the crew grew more confident. But the next challenge was looming: how to sustain their growing population. The crew was already stretched thin, and they knew that as their colony grew, they would need more space, more food, and more resources. Elon's voice echoed in Sarah's mind. "How are we looking, Sarah? Are we ready to move to the next phase?" Sarah had read his message the day it came through, but she hadn't responded. She wasn't sure what to say. The colony was surviving, yes, but thriving? Not yet. They were making progress, but they were far from self-sustaining. They still relied on Earth for parts, equipment, and even some supplies. But Elon's question had brought something to the forefront of her mind. How much longer could they keep going like this? "We need to scale up," Sarah said to the team one afternoon. They had just completed another successful test of the water extraction system, and there was a sense of momentum in the air. "I want to start working on expanding the habitat. We need more room for the growing crew. But beyond that, we need a plan for sustainable growth. The ice is a big step, but we need more than water. We need systems in place to produce food, generate energy, and ensure that we're not dependent on Earth." Aiden looked up from his terminal, a serious expression on his face. "I've been thinking about that too. I've started designing a new module for the habitat expansion. It'll have a larger greenhouse, more energy storage, and better waste recycling. But we also need a plan for sourcing materials locally. We can't keep importing from Earth if we're serious about building a self-sustaining colony." Sarah nodded. "Exactly. We need to start thinking about mining resources on Mars itself. There's a lot of potential here, and if we can start extracting and using local materials, we can stop relying on Earth altogether." The thought of mining Mars for resources was daunting. It would take significant effort, time, and technology to get it right. But if they could pull it off, it would change everything. They wouldn't just be a colony. They would be a civilization, independent of Earth. Sarah knew the risks. The challenges ahead were enormous, and she was keenly aware of the stakes. But she had never been one to shy away from a challenge, not when there was so much at stake. As the weeks passed, the team continued to work on the habitat expansion, water extraction, and the design for the mining systems. Every breakthrough, no matter how small, felt like a triumph. But the pressure was mounting. The Martian environment was unforgiving, and every day spent on the planet felt like a race against time. Sarah spent more and more hours poring over reports, reviewing systems, and double-checking everything. She knew that their success hinged on getting every detail right. There was no room for error. But even as the pressure grew, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. They were on the brink of something big. It was clear that they weren't just building a colony, they were building a future. And then, one evening, as Sarah walked through the new habitat module, she paused, staring out at the landscape beyond. The wind had picked up, carrying dust across the plains of Mars. It was another reminder that, for all their progress, Mars would always be a harsh, unpredictable world. But that was what made it so beautiful, so wild, and so full of potential. A colony on Mars might have been a dream once, but now it was a reality, and they were just getting started. As the Martian colony continued to grow, the sense of accomplishment was palpable. Every new breakthrough, every challenge overcome, was another step toward their ultimate goal, a self-sustaining, independent human presence on Mars. But with that progress came the undeniable realization that the harder path lay ahead. They could no longer rely on Earth. To truly thrive on Mars, the crew needed to take their next big leap. Sarah sat in her quarters late one night, staring at the map of Mars projected on the wall in front of her. It was a digital representation of the terrain near their base, with marked points for water deposits, potential mining sites, and locations for future habitat expansion. As she studied the map, her mind raced with possibilities. "We're not there yet," she muttered under her breath. They had come so far, but Mars had a way of reminding them that they were still far from achieving the independence they so desperately needed. Resources from Earth, tools, materials, spare parts, had been critical to the success of the mission so far. But they couldn't continue this way forever. If the crew was going to survive long-term, they had to find ways to extract and use the planet's resources themselves. The next morning, Sarah called an urgent meeting with the crew. They gathered in the common area, their faces tired but focused, ready to tackle the next phase of their mission. "I know we've made incredible progress, but we're at a crossroads," Sarah began, her voice firm yet filled with urgency. "The breakthroughs in water extraction and the expansion of the habitat are important steps. But we need to talk about the bigger picture. How do we make this colony truly self-sufficient? How do we take that next step toward independence from Earth?" The room fell silent as the weight of her words sank in. Everyone knew the truth, but no one had dared say it aloud. They were dependent on Earth in ways that could be dangerous, especially if something went wrong. If communications were lost, if a supply mission was delayed, or worse, if Earth faced a catastrophe of its own. "We need to start thinking about resource extraction," Sarah continued. "We've found ice under the surface, and that's a start. But we can't rely on that alone. We need to start mining for metals, minerals, and anything else that can support construction, energy production, and food production. We need to build our infrastructure here, locally, with local materials." Aiden, who had been closely monitoring the rover's mining operations, spoke up. "The problem is, Mars doesn't have the same types of resources as Earth. We can't just mine for copper and iron like we would back home. Mars' crust is composed mostly of basalt, and while there are traces of iron, extracting it in any meaningful amount is going to be a huge challenge. The good news is that we've seen signs of water ice, and there's a potential for some rare metals like lithium in certain locations. We just have to figure out how to access them." "Exactly," Sarah said, nodding. "But we need to start now. We can't afford to wait. I want everyone to start researching how we can utilize the resources we have access to right now. We'll start small, with the rover-based mining system, but we'll need to scale up. This is going to be a big task." The crew split up to focus on various aspects of the problem. Aiden, working with their engineering team, began designing a larger-scale mining operation, one that would be capable of drilling deeper into the Martian soil and extracting minerals and metals. They had already begun studying the possibility of harnessing geothermal energy, but it was still in its infancy. The idea was that the heat beneath Mars' surface could power energy generators and systems to help with resource extraction and refining. Sarah worked closely with the agricultural team, brainstorming how to make their greenhouse systems even more efficient. With the water supply now more reliable, they needed to figure out how to ramp up food production. Sarah's long-term vision was for a full-scale, multi-tier farming system. Not just hydroponics or aeroponics, but a system that would include growing crops in Martian soil, mixed with Earth-based nutrients. It was risky, but the potential benefits were immense. They could cut back on supplies from Earth and grow more of their own food. Elon's message kept running through her mind: "You're pioneers. What you do now will change the course of human history." The days that followed were filled with feverish work. The first mining drill run had been successful, but it had been a slow process. Extracting usable metals from Mars was no simple feat. The minerals that Aiden's team had identified were buried deep, and the rover's drill was only capable of reaching the shallowest deposits. They would need to design something larger, more powerful, a mobile mining operation that could be deployed across Mars. In the meantime, the greenhouse had started producing more crops, but it wasn't enough to sustain them if they expanded the colony. They needed to find a way to grow food more quickly and in larger quantities. Sarah reached out to experts back on Earth, collaborating with agricultural scientists to figure out how to scale up production. One afternoon, while Sarah was reviewing a new set of greenhouse data, she got a message from Elon. She opened it immediately, her heart beating faster with anticipation. "Sarah," the message began, "I've been following your progress closely, and I'm beyond impressed. You and your team are doing extraordinary work. The ice extraction was a breakthrough, and your plans for resource extraction on Mars are exactly what we need. But remember, there's no rush to be completely independent of Earth. Keep pushing forward, but don't sacrifice quality for speed. It's a marathon, not a sprint." Sarah smiled as she read the message. It was a good reminder. There was no need to rush. They needed to be careful with each step they took, especially when dealing with Mars unknowns. But the idea of full independence from Earth, of becoming a truly self-sustaining colony, was something that couldn't be ignored. Days turned into weeks, and the colony grew. With each new mining operation and each step toward food independence, they began to feel a sense of momentum. They were no longer just surviving on Mars. They were building something bigger, a future. But that future still felt fragile, like a house of cards. They were pushing forward, yes, but they had no idea what Mars would throw at them next. The next challenge came in the form of an unexpected Martian dust storm. The storm hit without warning, blocking out the sun and throwing their energy systems into disarray. For a few days, the colony was left without power. Water recyclers, oxygen systems, and heating mechanisms all relied on solar energy, and the storm knocked out their ability to recharge the batteries. It was a reminder of Mars' unforgiving nature. "We've got to find a backup power solution," Sarah said, pacing around the control center. "We can't rely solely on solar. We need something that can keep the systems running during these storms. A backup power source, maybe wind energy or even nuclear power, if we can get it to work safely." Aiden nodded in agreement. "Solar's been our main source, but Mars dust storms are a real problem. Wind power could be a good option, especially since we've been seeing more consistent winds in some regions. We'll need to test it." In the aftermath of the storm, the team worked around the clock to get their systems back online and put contingencies in place. It was a painful lesson in the reality of Martian life. No matter how prepared you thought you were, there was always something that could go wrong. The storm had cost them valuable time, but it had also driven home an important point. Their push for independence had to come with the understanding that there would be setbacks. As Sarah gazed out at the Martian horizon again, she couldn't help but feel a sense of awe mixed with fear. They were making history, but the road ahead would be long, and Mars was unforgiving. The challenges they faced were monumental, but if they could push through, if they could find a way to thrive here, they would change humanity's future forever. One step at a time. The dust storm on Mars had been a terrifying reminder of the planet's volatility. For a few days, it felt as though the colony's fragile existence hung by a thread. The solar panels were covered in thick red dust, blocking out the sun and halting their power production. Energy reserves were quickly depleting, and without power, even the most basic functions of the colony, water recycling, oxygen production, heating, would grind to a halt. It was a race against time. Sarah had stayed in the control room for hours, monitoring the data feeds from every system. Aiden was beside her, fingers flying over his tablet, trying to come up with solutions as the storm raged outside. The air filtration system was still functioning, but only just. The greenhouse lights were on backup batteries, but they wouldn't last long. "Can we activate the wind turbines?" Sarah asked, looking over at Aiden. "They're ready, but they won't help if the storm is this intense," he replied, his brow furrowed in frustration. "We need to wait for it to pass before we can deploy them. The turbines might get damaged if the winds are too strong." Just then, a notification flashed across Sarah's screen. The main battery reserve was down to 12%. They had less than 24 hours before the oxygenators would begin to fail. "We can't wait," Sarah said, determination in her voice. "We need to get those turbines up and running, even if it's risky. We have no other choice." Aiden nodded reluctantly. "Okay, I'll start the process to initiate them, but if the storm doesn't clear soon, we're going to be in trouble. I'll need the team's help to get the turbines positioned safely." Within hours, the team mobilized. It was all hands on deck as they rushed to install and deploy the wind turbines. The storm continued to rage outside, with gusts so strong they shook the walls of the habitat. It felt like nature itself was trying to shake them off the planet. But Sarah couldn't afford to give in to fear. They were building something monumental. They couldn't afford to lose it now. Aiden and his team worked quickly, connecting the turbines to the emergency power grid. It was a delicate operation. The winds were powerful, and the storm's ferocity only seemed to increase as they worked. But slowly, they began to see results. The turbines spun to life. By the time the storm had passed, it was clear that they had made it through. The wind turbines had kept the systems running, albeit at a reduced capacity. The sun had finally started to pierce through the dust clouds, and the solar panels began to regain their charge. The backup systems had held up just long enough to keep the colony from shutting down entirely. Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The immediate crisis had passed, but the damage had been done. They were behind on their schedule, and it was clear that they needed more robust power solutions to deal with Mars' unpredictable weather patterns. "We survived," Sarah said quietly, watching as the team finished securing the turbines. But we need to plan for the next storm. We can't rely on luck again. Later that evening, the crew gathered for a debriefing in the common area. Everyone was exhausted but relieved. The tension of the past few days had finally begun to lift, but there was still much work to do. Sarah stood at the front of the room, looking at the team. We've been through a lot, but we've made it. Thanks to everyone's quick thinking and hard work, we avoided disaster. But this storm made it clear that we can't just be reactive. We need a long-term plan for power generation. We can't afford to put all our eggs in one basket, especially when it comes to energy. Aiden stood up next to her. We're already researching backup power systems, and the turbines will help. But we also need to start thinking about other energy sources, like geothermal. I know it's going to take time, but we've got to get something more reliable in place. Sarah nodded. Agreed. I also want to push forward on mining. If we can start extracting metals and minerals, we can use those resources to build more sustainable power infrastructure. But that's a long-term goal. In the short term, we need to focus on getting more turbines up and increasing the energy grid capacity. As the meeting ended, Sarah found herself alone in the control room again. The storm had passed, but its impact was still fresh in her mind. She stared at the screens, watching the slow but steady recovery of their systems. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to give them a fighting chance. For now, Mars was a planet that could never be tamed. Every day was a battle, and the stakes were higher than they had ever been before. The colony's survival depended on their ability to adapt quickly, to innovate in the face of the unknown. But Mars also had a strange beauty. It was a harsh, unforgiving world, yet it offered them the opportunity to do something extraordinary, to be the first to build a new world. The days following the storm were filled with long hours of work and planning. The energy grid had been stabilized, and the turbines were now providing a reliable, though modest, source of power. The team had begun laying the groundwork for future mining operations, and Aiden had started mapping out potential geothermal sites. But while progress was being made, it was clear that they were still in the early stages of this journey. The colony was far from self-sufficient, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were playing catch-up, always one step behind. Every breakthrough came with a new set of challenges. Every step forward felt precarious. One evening, Sarah received a communication from Elon Musk. She had been expecting it, but it still sent a chill down her spine. Sarah, I'm following your progress closely, and I'm impressed by how you and your team handled the storm. I know it was a setback, but the fact that you're pushing forward shows the kind of resilience we need to succeed on Mars. Keep at it. I believe in you. It was a simple message, but it carried weight. Sarah had always admired Elon's vision, his unwavering belief that humanity could achieve the impossible. But the reality of life on Mars was proving to be more difficult than any of them had imagined. It was one thing to talk about the future. It was another to live it. She closed the message, letting out a deep breath. They were getting closer to independence, but the road ahead was long and uncertain. As the crew worked late into the night, Sarah stood outside for a moment, gazing up at the Martian sky. The stars were brilliant, brighter than she had ever seen them on Earth. It was an alien world, and yet, it felt like home. Mars was unforgiving, yes, but it was also full of possibilities. And as Sarah stood there, she made a silent promise to herself, and to everyone back on Earth, that they wouldn't stop until they had built something lasting, something that could change the course of history. Mars had a way of testing its inhabitants in ways that no one could predict. With the dust storm now behind them, Sarah felt both a sense of accomplishment and a looming anxiety about the future. The recent crisis had shown them that, despite all the technological marvels they had brought with them from Earth, they were still at the mercy of the planet's unpredictable forces. But there was another, quieter pressure building. A pressure to prove that this colony could stand on its own 2 feet, without Earth's support. Elon's message had been encouraging, but it was also a reminder that the world was watching them. They were the first people to truly attempt to colonize Mars, and success or failure would echo across human history. Sarah, we've got a problem. Aiden's voice crackled over the comms as Sarah walked back to the main hub. What is it? Sarah responded, her mind already running through a list of possible issues. We've hit a significant snag with the geothermal drilling. The site we thought would be perfect for the energy extraction system is showing signs of instability. The readings from the sensor array indicate there could be a major fault line beneath the surface. Sarah paused, the weight of the situation sinking in. Instability? Could it be dangerous? Not immediately, Aiden said, his voice calm but serious. But it's a risk. We're going to need to do a full geological survey before proceeding any further. If the fault line is active, it could cause a serious problem if we drill deeper. Understood. Let me know what you find out. We need to keep pushing forward, but safely. As she ended the call, Sarah couldn't help but feel a pang of frustration. This mission had always been about taking risks, about stepping into the unknown and finding a way to make it work. But Mars was constantly throwing curveballs. The dream of an independent colony was within their grasp, yet every step forward seemed to bring another obstacle. Later that day, Sarah called a meeting with the crew to discuss the latest issue. The control room was dimly lit, and the hum of machines provided the only sound as the team gathered around the table. We're facing a challenge with the geothermal drilling site, Sarah began, looking at each of the crew members. There's a fault line beneath the surface, and we need to conduct a more extensive geological survey before we move forward. How long will that take? Aiden asked, his brow furrowed. It could take a few weeks, Sarah replied. The survey equipment will need to be set up, and we'll need to run a full analysis. If the fault line is active, we'll have to reconsider the location entirely. We've been relying on geothermal energy as our backup plan for months, Emma, the lead scientist on agriculture, said. Without it, we're going to be even more dependent on solar, and if we have another storm like the last one. I know, Sarah interrupted. It's not ideal, but we need to be cautious. This colony can't afford to make mistakes when it comes to energy. For a moment, the room was quiet as everyone considered the ramifications. The team had grown close over the past few years, and their trust in Sarah was unwavering. But the pressure was mounting. They could feel the weight of history on their shoulders. We'll keep looking for alternatives, Sarah said, breaking the silence. But in the meantime, I want to start testing a new agricultural system that could help us increase food production. It's time we experiment with growing crops in Martian soil, mixed with Earth-based nutrients. It might be a game changer, but it's going to be a challenge. As the team dispersed to begin their tasks, Sarah stayed behind in the control room. She stared at the screens, her fingers tapping absent-mindedly against the console. The colony's survival depended on their ability to innovate and adapt. The truth was, they had no choice but to experiment. This wasn't just about survival. It was about proving that humanity could thrive on Mars. And if their research into soil-based farming succeeded, it could be a significant step toward independence. But there was a risk involved. The Martian soil was harsh, with high levels of perchlorates, chemicals that could be toxic to plants. It wasn't just about growing crops. It was about creating a sustainable ecosystem. And for that, they needed to understand the planet's ecosystem in a way no one had before. The next few weeks were filled with intense experimentation. Sarah, Emma, and the agricultural team worked tirelessly, testing different soil mixtures, adjusting variables like temperature, water levels, and light exposure. The results were promising. Some plants began to sprout, despite the challenging conditions. But it wasn't a guaranteed success. I think we're getting close, Emma said one evening, standing in front of one of the test crops. It was a small plant, its green shoots fragile but determined. The soil mixture is working. The crops are growing, but we need to make sure they're safe to consume. We've got to test the perchlorates in the soil to ensure they won't contaminate the food. I trust you, Emma, Sarah said, trying to maintain her optimism. Keep pushing forward. This could change everything for us. Meanwhile, Aiden and his team had completed the geological survey. The fault line was not as active as they had feared, but it was still a risk. The team decided to proceed with caution, setting up additional monitoring systems and adjusting the drilling parameters to ensure they didn't go too deep too quickly. As the team moved forward with both the geothermal drilling and the agricultural experiments, the sense of urgency in the air became palpable. Each success felt like a small victory, but the stakes were higher than ever. Mars was unforgiving, and time was running out. They couldn't afford to waste it. One day, a breakthrough arrived unexpectedly. While testing a batch of Martian soil mixed with Earth-based nutrients, the team discovered that the plants weren't just surviving, they were thriving. The crops showed more vitality than anyone had expected, and the signs of perchlorate contamination were minimal. It was an enormous relief, one that sent ripples of excitement through the entire colony. "This could be it," Emma said, her voice trembling with excitement. "We can grow food in Martian soil. We just need to scale it up." "Start a larger batch," Sarah ordered, her voice steady despite the excitement she felt inside. "This is the breakthrough we've been waiting for. If we can grow enough crops to feed the entire colony, we'll be one step closer to full independence." Meanwhile, Aiden's team successfully deployed the geothermal system. They had been cautious, and it had paid off. With the additional monitoring in place, the drill was now safely tapping into the planet's geothermal energy, supplying them with a stable and reliable power source. The colony was now more self-sufficient than ever before. They had power, water, and a growing food supply, all produced using Mars' own resources. But there was still much to be done. The dream of an independent Mars was still a distant vision, but it was now a vision that was becoming tangible. Sarah stood alone in the observatory one evening, looking out over the Martian landscape. The colony was growing, and every day felt like a small victory. They were proving that humanity could survive and thrive on Mars. But there was still so much to do, so many unknowns. Mars was a harsh, unforgiving world, but they were learning how to navigate its challenges. She thought back to the conversations with Elon Musk, his messages full of encouragement, but also full of the weight of expectation. They were pioneering a new frontier, and the world was watching. But for Sarah, it wasn't about the accolades. It was about the team, about the people who had sacrificed everything to make this colony a reality. And now, after months of struggle, failure, and perseverance, they were on the brink of something extraordinary. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were building something new. The Martian landscape stretched endlessly before Sarah, bathed in the soft, rust-colored light of the setting sun. The colony's growth was undeniable. They had power now, a food source beginning to take shape, and the geothermal energy system was humming steadily in the background. But with every step forward, the weight of responsibility grew heavier. Mars wasn't just a place to survive. It was a place to build a future. And that future wasn't going to come without a price. It had been a week since the breakthrough with the agricultural system. The crops, once fragile and unsure, had begun to take root in the Martian soil, showing growth that surpassed even the most optimistic expectations. But with every bit of progress, Sarah knew there would be more tests, more challenges, and inevitably, more risks. "We need to scale this up," Emma had said with a glint of excitement in her eyes. "We're growing small batches, but if we can expand, we might be able to feed the entire colony." But Sarah's cautious nature had prevented her from fully committing. "We're still running tests," she had replied, knowing the perils of jumping too quickly into something that wasn't fully understood. "We need to confirm the soil's safety before we plant any significant quantity of food." That night, the conversation with Elon Musk replayed in Sarah's mind. "Keep pushing forward. I'm impressed with your progress. But remember, Mars is a proving ground. It's going to be tougher than you imagine. Don't take unnecessary risks." It was easy to hear his words and feel encouraged by them, but it was harder to act on them when Mars itself was throwing so many challenges their way. A small misstep, a slight deviation from their plan, could lead to irreversible consequences. The stakes were higher than ever. The next morning, the entire team gathered in the main hub for a status update. The energy systems were stable, the food crops were growing, and the geothermal system was operating at full capacity. They were managing. But Sarah felt like they were on the edge of a precipice, staring down at a future where everything could fall apart in an instant. "Everything's looking good," Aiden said, reviewing the energy grid. "But we've noticed something strange with the geothermal system. The temperature of the core beneath us is higher than we anticipated. If we don't manage it carefully, we risk overheating the system." Sarah leaned forward, her expression turning serious. "What's the worst-case scenario?" "If the heat's too much, it could cause a system failure. We'd lose our backup power and heating, and it could disrupt the greenhouse and water systems," Aiden explained. "Can we control it?" she asked, a sense of dread settling in her chest. "We've implemented cooling systems, but they're only so effective. I'd recommend reducing our reliance on the geothermal system for a while, until we get a better sense of how it's performing. Sarah nodded slowly. We'll cut back. We can rely more on solar until we get this under control. The team had been riding high on the success of their recent breakthroughs, but now they were reminded that every step forward came with new challenges. The geothermal system, once a symbol of their self-sufficiency, was now a potential threat to the entire colony. In the days that followed, the tension in the colony was palpable. The geothermal system was no longer fully operational, and the team worked quickly to find solutions. Aiden and his team scoured the data for patterns, hoping to identify a solution before the power reserves dipped too low. Meanwhile, Emma's team continued testing the crops, but Sarah couldn't shake the nagging fear that things could go wrong at any moment. We've got to fix this, Sarah, Aiden said one evening as he looked over the energy data. We can't afford to keep running on backup. We need a permanent solution to keep the power steady. I know, Sarah replied. We're working on it. But if the geothermal system fails completely, we're going to need more than just power. We'll need a way to manage everything, from water to oxygen to food. One system going down could compromise the whole structure. A few days later, Emma approached Sarah with a concern that had been growing in her mind. We need to talk about the crops. The plants are growing well, but there's something I've noticed with the Martian soil. Some of the crops are showing signs of toxicity. The perchlorates are still causing problems, even with the Earth-based nutrients. Sarah's stomach sank. Toxicity? How bad is it? It's not widespread yet, but it's getting worse as we scale up. If we're not careful, we could have an entire crop fail. And if we don't find a way to remove the perchlorates, we might have to stop growing on Mars soil altogether. Emma's words hit Sarah harder than she expected. The promise of self-sufficiency, the thing they had been striving for, was beginning to slip away. If the crops failed, they would be right back where they started, dependent on Earth. But there was no time to dwell on the problem. The energy crisis was growing more urgent. With the geothermal system not fully operational and the backup solar power beginning to dwindle, Sarah found herself faced with a decision. They needed to make a bold move. Late one night, as the power reserves dropped to a critical level, Sarah called a meeting with the core team. The tension in the room was thick. We can't keep relying on the backup systems for much longer, Sarah began, her voice steady but filled with resolve. We need to make a choice. Either we wait for the geothermal system to stabilize and risk running out of power, or we double down on solar and start building more energy storage. It's going to take a lot of work, but we don't have a choice. Aiden stood up, rubbing his temples. Building more solar panels isn't going to solve the problem long-term. We need to stabilize the geothermal system. The other option is to look into nuclear power, but that brings a whole new set of complications. Then we push the solar panels to their limit, Sarah said firmly. We can start on the nuclear option, but it'll take months to get the infrastructure for that. For now, we double down on what we have, and we make it work. This colony is about resilience. If we don't keep pushing forward, we'll fail. And failure is not an option. For the next several days, the team worked tirelessly to maximize the solar energy output. They reconfigured the solar array to catch every possible ray of sunlight, and Aiden oversaw the installation of additional storage systems to hold the energy. Meanwhile, Sarah coordinated with Emma and the agricultural team to find a solution for the crops, searching for ways to neutralize the perchlorates without resorting to toxic chemicals. It wasn't easy. It was exhausting, but they were determined. Every day, they pushed harder, knowing that Mars wouldn't make it easy for them, but they couldn't stop now. Then, a breakthrough arrived, not in the form of new technology or better energy systems, but in a simple, almost overlooked idea. Emma, while reevaluating the crop tests, had an epiphany. I think I know how we can neutralize the perchlorates, she said, nearly breathless with excitement. There's a process that uses microorganisms to break down the chemicals. It's used on Earth for contaminated soil. We can adapt it for Martian conditions. Sarah stared at her, feeling a flicker of hope. How long will it take? 2 weeks, maybe 3. But we can start testing immediately. The tension was far from gone, but this small victory gave Sarah and the team the boost they needed. They were inching closer to solving their energy crisis and cracking the agricultural dilemma, but the work was far from over. Mars demanded constant attention, constant innovation. The price of progress was steep, but there was no turning back now. The days on Mars had started to blur together. With every passing day, Sarah could feel the tension rise, but so too did the sense of determination. They were fighting for survival, yes, but they were also fighting for something greater, for a new beginning, for proof that humanity could not only survive on Mars, but thrive. Yet despite the small victories that had come from Emma's discovery of microbial soil remediation and Aiden's work with the solar arrays, there was still a feeling that the team was barely keeping their heads above water. In the depths of Mars' harsh atmosphere, there were no guarantees. Success was never promised, only earned through sweat, grit, and constant adaptation. As Sarah sat at her desk in the control room, reviewing the daily logs, her thoughts wandered back to Earth. It was hard to imagine a life beyond the stark confines of the colony. She had left Earth as a trailblazer, part of the first wave of colonizers who had dared to believe that Mars could be home. But now, she couldn't help but wonder, was it worth it? When she first landed on Mars, it had been a dream to make history, to give humanity a new home. But now, after months of stress and constant failure, that dream seemed far more distant. Mars wasn't Earth, and it was never going to be. The breakthrough with the crops was just the first of many challenges they faced. Emma had used a unique strain of bacteria to neutralize the perchlorates in the soil, and initial tests were promising. But the bacteria's long-term effects remained unknown. The colony was walking a tightrope, trying to balance technological advancement with the risk of irreversible consequences. And then there was the geothermal system. After weeks of tinkering, Aiden had managed to stabilize the temperature fluctuation, but the system was still vulnerable. They had managed to keep the backup solar system running at full capacity, but it was a temporary fix. The real solution lay in stabilizing the geothermal grid, which was still their most reliable long-term source of power. Sarah gathered the team in the main hub for another crucial meeting. The air felt thick, and a sense of fatigue was evident in everyone's eyes. "We've got some good news," Sarah started, trying to keep the mood positive despite the weight of the situation. "Emma's microbial solution seems to be working. The crops have improved, and the perchlorates are being neutralized. We're on the path to having a sustainable food source." There was a small murmur of approval from the team, but Sarah could tell the excitement was tempered with caution. They had faced so many setbacks. They were hesitant to celebrate anything too soon. "But," she continued, "we're not out of the woods yet. The geothermal system is stable for now, but we need to continue monitoring it closely. Aiden and his team are working on that, and we'll need everyone's help to keep everything running smoothly." Aiden cleared his throat. "We've made some improvements, but we're still a long way from being fully reliable. If the system fails again, we could lose everything: power, water, food. We need to start diversifying our energy sources, especially if we want to make this colony self-sustaining. Which is why we need to speed up the construction of the solar arrays," Sarah said, her mind already spinning with the next steps. "We can't afford to have just one source of energy. If we keep relying too heavily on geothermal, we're gambling with our future." "Agreed," Aiden said. "And we should also start looking into backup systems for water filtration. The Martian water supply is not as reliable as we hoped. It's better than it was, but we can't afford to ignore the risks." As Sarah looked around the room, she could see how much each person had changed over the past few months. They were no longer the wide-eyed pioneers who had arrived on Mars with dreams of making history. They were weary, battle-tested survivors. The sacrifices they had made were mounting, physically, emotionally, and mentally, but they were still here, still standing. "All right," Sarah said, her voice breaking through the silence. "We've got a lot of work ahead, but we've made it this far. Mars isn't going to make it easy, but we're not backing down. We're creating something that will last. This is just the beginning." Later that day, Sarah stood on the observation deck, looking out over the colony. The construction of the new solar array was moving quickly. The geothermal system was stable, for now, and the crops, though fragile, were growing. A small part of her still doubted if they could truly make this work. But another part of her, the part that had always driven her forward, refused to give up. They had come this far. They had made it through the worst of the storms, both literal and figurative. They had the tools, the knowledge, and the determination to keep going. They were pioneers, after all, and pioneers didn't quit. Aiden was the first to approach her, his hands covered in dirt from the geothermal maintenance. "I think we've made a breakthrough," he said with a cautious optimism in his voice. Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Go on." "I've been reconfiguring the thermal regulators. It's still not perfect, but I think we've found a way to stabilize the system long-term. The geothermal power could be our main source once again, but we're going to need a new kind of backup system for when things go wrong." "Sounds promising," Sarah said, feeling a surge of hope. "If we can stabilize the geothermal system and back it up with solar, that would solve half of our problems." "What about the water filtration?" "We're working on it. I've got the team looking into some new filtration tech that might work in the Martian environment." Sarah nodded. "Keep me posted. We're almost there. Just need to keep pushing." As the days passed, the team continued working relentlessly. They built more solar arrays, improved the geothermal system, and tested new methods of filtration and irrigation. Every day brought a new challenge, but it also brought new opportunities. The colony was no longer just a fragile experiment. It was a growing, evolving testament to what humanity could accomplish when they refused to give up. Sarah spent her nights in the control room, poring over data and refining the colony's systems. The work was exhausting, but each small success felt like a beacon of hope. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were thriving. And they were ready to take the next step. One evening, as Sarah watched the Martian sun dip below the horizon, she received a message from Earth. It was a simple one, but one that carried weight. "Keep up the good work. We're watching. You're making history." For the first time in a long while, Sarah felt a spark of pride. It was small, but it was there. They had done it. They had found a way forward. They were no longer just the first to land on Mars. They were the first to build a future there. The cold, red surface of Mars stretched out beneath the colony as Sarah stood in the observation room, looking out at the horizon. The colony's structures were still relatively modest, but they were growing. The solar arrays, newly installed, were catching every bit of sunlight that reached the planet. The geothermal system, though fragile, was humming along in the background, and the food crops were starting to show signs of promise. But it wasn't just the colony that had grown. The world had been watching, and that was about to change everything. It started with a simple message, a daily update from Earth, sent as it always was, for the team to review their progress. But this time, the tone was different. It was shorter, more urgent. Sarah read the message aloud to the team, her voice barely masking the tension she felt. "The world is waiting. Progress on Mars is crucial. People are watching. Governments, private investors, the media, they all want results. It's time to prove you're not just surviving, but thriving. The stakes have never been higher. Keep up the momentum." The room fell silent as the last words hung in the air. For months, Sarah and her team had been operating in relative isolation, free from the prying eyes of the public. They were pioneers, yes, but they were also builders, focused solely on their survival and long-term goals. But now, the pressure was mounting. "We can't let this distract us," Aiden said, breaking the silence. "We've been doing this the right way, methodically, carefully. Let's not let Earth's expectations change how we operate." Sarah nodded, but her thoughts were already racing. The world was watching, and soon, they would all be expecting something. The media, governments, and investors were all invested in Mars now. They had a stake in the future of the colony, and every misstep, every failure, would be amplified by the attention they were about to get. "We've been on the right path," Sarah said, trying to steady her own nerves. "But we need to make sure we stay on course. Let's focus on the next steps and not the noise from Earth. We can't let outside pressure force us into decisions we aren't ready for." But despite her own assurances, Sarah felt the weight of it all pressing down on her. For months, their success had been driven by the drive to survive, to make history, to prove it could be done. But now, success felt like a spotlight, bright and unforgiving. A few days later, the media frenzy began. News outlets from all over the world began broadcasting updates from Mars, tracking every step the team made. With each new piece of progress, the headlines grew more dramatic. Mars colony's first crop, A victory for humanity? Mars breakthrough, geothermal energy system stabilized. The future of Mars. Colonists push forward against the odds. The world had been captivated by their achievements, but it wasn't just support they were receiving. Criticism came quickly, too. Is Mars ready for human habitation? Can the Martian colony survive without Earth's aid? Are the colonists on Mars taking too many risks? The barrage of opinions was relentless. It was the first time Sarah and her team were truly exposed to the scrutiny of the world. It wasn't just their lives at stake anymore. It was the entire future of Mars as a potential home for humanity. And with that future came a weight of expectations they had never fully anticipated. People are going to keep doubting us, Aiden said one night. As he sat across from Sarah in the control room, the team had gathered to review the latest updates from Earth. They'll always question our decisions. They'll question if we're doing things fast enough, safely enough. We can't get caught up in the noise, Sarah replied, her tone firm. We've been doing the right thing from the start. Slow, steady, cautious. We can't let anyone rush us. But Sarah could feel it. The pressure. The constant, unrelenting pressure of knowing that every decision, every failure, would be watched by billions. It wasn't just the future of the colony that was on the line. It was the future of humanity on Mars. The next few days saw more media attention than they could have ever imagined. Cameras were pointed toward them from Earth, broadcasted live, as news outlets eagerly reported every development. Sarah had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. It was no longer just about building a home on Mars. It was about living up to the expectations of an entire planet. But there was something else, something that none of them had anticipated. With all the media coverage came new attention from potential investors. Sarah received her first message from an interested party, a billionaire with an eye on space colonization. They wanted to meet with her. They wanted to invest in the Mars colony. The idea of corporate interests influencing the direction of their colony made Sarah uneasy, but she couldn't ignore the potential benefits. With additional funding, they could build more sustainable energy systems, improve life support technologies, and even begin expanding the colony faster. But she couldn't shake the thought that these investors, these corporations, might have their own agendas. Would they prioritize profit over safety? Would they push the team to take risks for the sake of progress? The meeting came sooner than expected. Sarah, Aiden, Emma, and the rest of the team sat at the conference table in the main hub, waiting for the video call to connect. When the screen blinked to life, a tall, sharp-featured man appeared in front of them, a well-groomed face with a calm, businesslike demeanor. "I'm Jacob Winters," he began, his voice smooth and authoritative. "I represent a group of investors who believe in what you're doing here on Mars. We see the potential. We believe that your work is the future of humanity." Sarah nodded but remained cautious. "We're grateful for the interest, but we're also in the early stages. Our focus is on making sure we have a sustainable, safe colony before we consider expanding." Jacob smiled, his gaze unwavering. "Of course, we understand that. But we also know that to accelerate your progress, you'll need more resources, more funding, more technology. We can offer that." Aiden spoke up. "We've been very careful with our decisions so far. We don't want to rush things for the sake of external pressure. This is about more than just speed. It's about ensuring Mars is habitable for the long term." Jacob nodded, understanding, but his eyes gleamed with a certain intensity. "And we understand the need for caution. But you don't have the luxury of time. The world is watching, and if you don't take advantage of this moment, you risk falling behind." The conversation continued for over an hour, with Jacob laying out the potential benefits of their investment. He spoke about faster development of key technologies, mass production of solar arrays, and even bringing more workers to Mars to accelerate colonization. It was tempting. The funding could solve many of their problems, particularly with energy and resources. But Sarah knew that taking this step would come with new risks. They weren't just building a colony anymore. They were building a spectacle, an investment for others. "Think about it," Jacob said, his tone persuasive. "This is a chance to make history, faster than you ever imagined." As the call ended, Sarah sat back in her chair, her mind racing. The world was watching, and now others were eager to shape Mars' future, too. But could they really balance progress with safety? Could they remain true to their mission to create a lasting, sustainable colony? Or would the lure of faster results and the pressure from Earth force them to make dangerous choices? Sarah sat in the control room, staring at the message from Jacob Winters. It felt like the weight of the entire world was on her shoulders. The colony on Mars, once a distant dream, had become a symbol of humanity's future, a future that now seemed to hang in the balance, influenced by investors eager to speed up the process. In the beginning, it had been all about survival. It had been about building something sustainable and making sure that humanity could thrive on a distant planet. But now, the stakes had changed. The pressure was no longer just about surviving Mars' harsh conditions. It was about building something that could be sold, marketed, and expanded rapidly. And the investors were making it clear that they expected results, fast. The conversation with Jacob Winters still echoed in her mind. His words had been persuasive, even seductive. You have the chance to change everything, Sarah. A thriving Mars colony isn't just a dream. It's an investment opportunity. We can help you accelerate your timeline, bring in the technology, the workforce, the resources you need. We have the power to make this colony self-sustaining, faster than you ever imagined. But we need your commitment. The world is watching, and they won't wait forever. She tried to stay calm, tried to keep the conversation focused on their mission, but she knew that the investors weren't just offering funding, they were offering a vision, a way of making Mars a commercial enterprise. I can't deny that the resources they're offering could solve a lot of problems, Aiden said, pacing the room. More solar arrays, new water filtration systems, workers to help build out the colony faster. It could change everything. But are we willing to compromise our safety, our methods? I think the real question is, how much are we willing to risk? Sarah replied. If we rush things, if we take on their terms, what does that mean for the colony in the long run? What happens if we cut corners and something goes wrong? The room fell into an uneasy silence. Sarah could see it in the faces of the team. They were all exhausted, weighed down by the constant pressure of their mission. The dream of Mars was starting to feel like a heavy burden. But there was another part of her, deep down, that knew they had to make a decision soon. The colony's future depended on it. The decision wasn't easy. Sarah spent the next few days going over the data, considering the risks. Aiden and Emma continued their work, while the others went about their daily tasks, but there was a palpable tension in the air. Every conversation, every meeting, seemed to circle back to the same question. Do we accept the investor's offer, or do we continue on our own? It wasn't just the technology or the funding that was at stake. It was the soul of the colony. Accepting the investor's terms would mean more control from Earth, more influence from outside forces. It would mean a faster, more aggressive push for expansion, but at the cost of their autonomy. But declining the offer meant facing another harsh reality: limited resources, slower progress, and the possibility of falling behind the global race for Mars colonization. The world was watching, and it wouldn't be long before other countries and private companies attempted to surpass their efforts. On the morning of their next team meeting, Sarah had made up her mind. The choice wasn't clear-cut, but the decision was now hers to make. She entered the meeting room, where Aiden, Emma, and the others were already gathered. The quiet hum of the life support system was the only sound breaking the silence. "I've made a decision," she said, her voice steady but filled with an undercurrent of tension. The team looked up, waiting. "I've spoken to the investors," she continued. "They've offered everything we need: more solar arrays, a more robust water filtration system, a workforce that could help us expand faster than we ever imagined. But," she paused, glancing at each of them, "I don't think we're ready for that." Aiden raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we're not ready to compromise on the integrity of our project. If we allow outside investors to dictate the pace, we risk losing the very thing we're building here. We need to stay true to our vision, one step at a time, at our own pace. If we rush things, we might succeed faster, but we also might fail faster." The room was silent for a long moment. It felt like the weight of the decision was being felt by everyone. Finally, Emma spoke up. "I agree. We can't afford to let the pressure get to us. This has always been about survival, about making something sustainable. If we let anyone force our hand, We're putting the whole project at risk. Aiden nodded. It's tempting to take the easy route, but we've worked too hard to get here. We can't let anyone speed up our timeline without understanding the consequences. It was a rare moment of unanimity. Everyone in the room was in agreement. They had built something on Mars, something real, and they weren't about to let anyone, even powerful investors, dictate the course of their future. But as the meeting ended and Sarah made her way back to her quarters, she couldn't shake the feeling that they had made a dangerous choice. The world was watching, and the pressure would only continue to mount. As Sarah sat down at her desk, her eyes drifted to the message from Jacob Winters that had started it all. The world is watching. You need to act fast. The opportunity is here, but it's not going to last forever. Sarah stared at the words for a long time, then deleted the message. It felt like a decisive action, one that sealed their fate. The investors were offering a shortcut, a way to speed up their progress. But they had decided to build something that would last, a colony that was sustainable, self-sufficient, and built on their own terms. Now, they would have to face the consequences. The pressure was only going to increase, but Sarah was ready. The team had made their choice. They weren't just building a colony. They were building a future, and that future would be on their own terms. Sarah stood at the edge of the Martian plateau, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The shadows of the colony's buildings stretched long across the red sand, their outlines stark against the dying light. It was moments like this, still, serene, and deeply humbling, that reminded her why they had chosen to take the long, hard road. Mars wasn't just about survival. It was about proving that humanity could live beyond Earth, that they could create something sustainable and meaningful on a world where nothing grew, where the air was too thin to breathe, and the cold could freeze you solid in minutes. But despite her quiet resolve, the pressure was beginning to show. The decision to reject the investors' offer had been difficult, but it was also the right one. They had chosen autonomy over external influence, sustainability over speed. Still, Sarah knew they were playing a dangerous game. With every passing day, the eyes of the world grew sharper, more demanding. Governments, media outlets, and corporations were all watching, waiting to see if they would succeed or fail. "We need to talk," Aiden said, breaking her from her thoughts. He was standing a few feet behind her, his silhouette outlined by the fading light. His voice was calm, but there was an urgency in his tone. Sarah turned to face him. "About what?" "About the decision we made. I've been thinking. I know we all agreed on it, but the pressure is building. The longer we're out here with limited resources, the more vulnerable we become." Sarah glanced back at the colony. The main structure was still standing strong, the hydroponic gardens inside growing steadily, and the life support systems were functioning without major issues. But they were still living hand-to-mouth, relying on Earth's supply shipments and their own ingenuity to get by. They weren't ready for the kind of expansion that the investors had promised. Yet the thought of turning down the opportunity for faster growth still weighed heavily on her. "We're doing the right thing," Sarah said, trying to reassure both Aiden and herself. "We've been building carefully, step by step. We're learning from every mistake. But if we start rushing to meet deadlines, if we try to expand too quickly, we might break." Aiden's expression softened, but his eyes still carried that familiar concern. "I get it, I do. But what happens if we run out of resources? What if we hit a critical point and Earth can't send help on time?" Sarah didn't have an answer. The reality was, they were taking a massive risk by trying to maintain complete control over the colony's growth. There was no safety net out here, no backup plan. If they encountered a disaster, it could be months, or even years, before help could reach them. The next morning, Sarah woke up to a surprising message. It was from Jacob Winters. "I understand your decision, Sarah, but I have to say this. The opportunity one offered is not one that will last. There are other investors who are already looking at Mars as a commercial enterprise, and they are not going to wait for you to catch up. The time to act is now. If you change your mind, we'll be here." Sarah read the message twice. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she sat in the quiet of the morning, staring out at the desolate Martian landscape. She had made the decision to turn them down, but as she thought about the future, about what lay ahead for the colony, she began to wonder whether she had been too idealistic. Do we really have a choice anymore? Emma asked that evening, as they sat around the table discussing their options. The world's expectations are not just about our survival. They want to see us thrive. If we continue at this pace, we'll never be able to meet those expectations. We'll always be playing catch-up. Aiden nodded, looking between Sarah and Emma. Maybe we were too focused on the long term. We've been so careful about staying independent, but what happens when the system starts to break down? When we can't keep up with what's needed to make this place truly self-sufficient? We need to start thinking about the bigger picture. Sarah looked at each of them, her mind racing. Aiden was right. The reality of living on Mars wasn't just about building a sustainable base. It was about surviving in an unforgiving environment where resources were limited and time was against them. They could only do so much with what they had. If they didn't get ahead of the curve, the colony could start unraveling faster than they could manage. It wasn't just the colony's survival that was on the line anymore. It was the dream of Mars itself. Could they prove to the world that a self-sustaining colony was possible? Or would they fall behind, overrun by corporations and investors who saw the planet as nothing more than a new frontier for profit? That night, as Sarah lay in her quarters, the decision kept gnawing at her. She had always been driven by the idea that humanity could do better, that they could build something better on Mars. But the cost of independence was becoming clearer with every passing day. And in the end, she knew that there were sacrifices to be made. The next morning, Sarah made her way to the communication hub. She had to speak with Jacob Winters again. The decision they had made felt like a gamble, one that might not pay off. If they continued on this course, they might run out of time. But if they accepted the investor's offer, they risked losing control over the project. She sent the message. I've reconsidered. Let's talk about moving forward. We need your resources to continue, but we'll need to maintain autonomy over the colony's direction. I want to make sure this remains a sustainable project for the long term, not just a business venture. If we can work together on that, then I'm open to discussing next steps. She hit send and leaned back in her chair, her heart pounding in her chest. There was no going back now. The reply came within hours. I'm glad to hear you're willing to discuss terms. We can certainly work together, Sarah. Let's move fast. Time is of the essence. As Sarah read the message, a new sense of clarity washed over her. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about building something that could endure, something that could inspire. She had made the choice to take the resources they needed, but on her own terms. The investors could help them build faster, but they wouldn't dictate how they did it. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision settle on her shoulders. The road ahead would be even harder than before, but now, at least, she felt like they had the means to succeed. And maybe, just maybe, they could do it on their own terms. The price of independence was high, but Sarah knew one thing for sure. The future of Mars wasn't just about technology or funding. It was about the people who believed in the impossible. And she believed. The months that followed Sarah's decision felt like a whirlwind. The agreement with the investors had been formalized, but it was clear from the start that it was not a one-size-fits-all partnership. The investors had been willing to negotiate the terms of control, agreeing to support the colony's growth with a heavy focus on technology and resource management, but only if Sarah and her team could ensure that their vision of sustainability and independence remained intact. It had been the most difficult negotiation of her life. The investors were powerful, influential, and hungry for results, but Sarah had held firm. She knew that Mars was not just a place for profit. It was the future of humanity, and that future needed to be built on principles that went beyond money. She had fought for a vision where humanity would live in harmony with the planet, not exploit it for short-term gain. As she stood on the observation deck of the colony, watching the sun rise over the Martian horizon, Sarah reflected on how far they had come. The early days had been tough, dealing with the unpredictability of their supplies, the harsh environment, the challenges of building a self-sustaining community. But they had done it. They were thriving. The partnership with the investors had accelerated their progress. With new solar arrays, advanced water filtration systems, and additional personnel to help with construction, they were able to expand the colony at an unprecedented rate. The colony now had 3 fully operational biodomes, each capable of supporting hundreds of people. They had developed new farming methods using Martian soil, which, while still experimental, had shown promising results. Emma had even found a way to use Martian dust to create building materials, reducing their dependency on Earth-based shipments. Aiden's engineering team had been able to construct an additional life support system that could sustain the colony for months without external aid. They had grown stronger, more self-sufficient, and more confident. But there were still challenges. Mars was unforgiving, and despite their advancements, they knew that every day was a battle. The investors were still watching, eager for quick results, but Sarah had learned to tune out the noise. She had her own timeline now, one that was dictated by the needs of the colony, not by outside pressures. One evening, as Sarah sat down to dinner with the team, Aiden brought up a topic that had been on everyone's mind. "We need to think about the next step," Aiden said, pushing his plate aside. "We've come a long way, but we've only just begun. The world is still waiting for a breakthrough. Mars is still an experiment, and we need to take it to the next level. But we can't do it alone." "I know," Sarah replied, looking around the table. "We've made a lot of progress, but this is only the beginning. The next phase will require all of us: engineering, biology, even marketing. We need the world to see that Mars isn't just a place for research, it's a new home." "The investors will want more," Emma said, a hint of skepticism in her voice. "They'll push for more. We'll need to keep our balance." "There's no way around that." Sarah nodded. "We'll have to be smart. But we've already proven that we can create something sustainable. I have no doubt that we can do more." As the conversation continued, the weight of what they had accomplished settled on Sarah's shoulders. They had taken the risky path, the road less traveled, and it had paid off. But the future still loomed large, full of uncertainties. There were political pressures from Earth, logistical challenges, and the undeniable fact that Mars was still a frontier, a place where anything could happen. 2 weeks later, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. It was Jacob Winters. After months of correspondence and occasional video calls, he had made the trip to Mars to see the progress firsthand. His arrival was a sign of the success of the partnership, but also a reminder that the investors still had expectations. Jacob was a tall, imposing figure, dressed in the sleek, practical clothing that was now standard for Earthbound travelers heading to Mars. He stepped off the shuttle and shook Sarah's hand firmly. His eyes were sharp, scanning the colony as they walked together toward the main control center. "You've done it," Jacob said, his voice a mix of admiration and curiosity. "I'll admit, I wasn't sure at first. But this is more than I expected. You've built something that works, something real." "We're just getting started," Sarah replied. "There's still a long way to go, but we're on the right track." As they toured the colony, Sarah showed Jacob the new farming systems, the engineering innovations, and the expanding infrastructure. The sheer scale of the operation now was impressive. The colony was not just a research outpost. It was beginning to resemble a thriving, self-sustaining community. Jacob nodded thoughtfully as they walked through one of the biodomes, watching the crops growing in Martian soil. "Impressive," he said again, "but you know the world is watching. You're not just proving this is possible for a few dozen people. You're proving it's possible for millions." That phrase lingered with Sarah as Jacob's visit continued. Millions. The stakes were higher than ever. Later that evening, they sat down for a private conversation in Sarah's office. Jacob had been quiet for most of the day, but now, in the quiet of her office, he was more candid. "I've been thinking," he said, leaning forward. "You've built something here. But if you want Mars to be more than just a scientific experiment, it's going to take a lot more. I've seen the projections, the need for massive infrastructure, a global approach to colonization. If we can't make Mars work for millions, then we've failed before we've even begun." Sarah leaned back in her chair, looking at Jacob carefully. "I agree. But it's not just about scaling up. It's about making sure that Mars is a place where people can live, thrive, and contribute to the future of humanity. This colony isn't a test. It's the foundation of something much bigger." Jacob was silent for a moment. Finally, he nodded. "You're right. But the investors won't stop pushing for results. They'll want us to expand faster, to open up more sectors of Mars to development. The world wants to see progress. And progress means growth, expansion." Sarah sighed. "I understand. But we're not here just to make a quick profit. We're here to build a future. We're here to create a home for humanity, one that's sustainable and lasting." Jacob stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, after a long pause, he spoke again. "You've got your vision, Sarah, but the world moves fast, and the investors will move even faster. The only question is, will you be able to keep up?" As Jacob left the office, Sarah was left with his words echoing in her mind. The future of Mars wasn't just about technology, resources, or infrastructure. It was about balancing the vision of independence and sustainability with the harsh reality of speed and scale. She had made it this far, but the real challenge was still ahead. As she looked out over the colony, the lights flickering in the distance, Sarah knew one thing for sure. The future of Mars was no longer just a dream. It was a reality, and it was theirs to build. Thank you for following Sarah's journey on Mars. What do you think? Was she right to stick to her vision of independence, or should she have moved faster to meet global expectations? Let me know your thoughts below, and stay tuned for more stories from the frontier of space exploration.